Victoria Sterling slapped the invoice down on the conference table like it was garbage. $86,000. She laughed. Actually laughed in front of 7 executives. You want me to believe a man running a shop out of a leased hangar spent $86,000 of his own money on my aircraft? Malcolm Hayes didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. He just picked the invoice back up, folded it once and slid it into his jacket pocket. Then he placed the hangar key on her desk and walked out. What happened next over the following 72 hours would ground every single one of her pilots, expose a fraud hidden inside a $48 million jet, and force one of the most powerful women in Texas to drive herself to a mechanic's shop and beg. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe. You're going to want to see how this one ends. The morning. Malcolm Hayes drove onto the Sterling Crown private airfield for the last time he had been awake for 22 hours straight. Not because he'd been partying. Not because he'd been out somewhere living a life that looked good on the outside. He'd been lying on a folding cot inside Hangar 7, a borrowed shop light overhead, double-checking torque specs on a flight control linkage that had been keeping him up for 3 nights running. How was 43 days into a job that was supposed to take 30? He was $69,400 into his own pocket on a job that wasn't supposed to cost him a single dollar out of pocket. And he was tired, not defeated. Malcolm Hayes didn't do defeated, but tired, the kind of tired that gets into your bones, that makes the coffee taste like hot water, no matter how strong you brew it, the kind that only a man holding together something bigger than himself ever really understands. He sat up on the cot at 5:47 in the morning, looked at the aircraft 30 feet away, gleaming under the hangar lights, and said 2 words to nobody in particular. There she is. Because she was something. She really was. A Bombardier Global 7500 that had come into this hangar looking like a machine that had given up. Hydraulic lines corroded. Electrical systems so tangled, 3 major avionics firms had turned down the contract before it ever reached Malcolm's desk. The flight control surfaces had been patched twice in the past 4 years by people who were apparently more interested in billing hours than in the aircraft actually surviving them. 3 companies, 3 refusals. Then the phone rang at Hayes Aeroworks. Malcolm had stared at the number. Sterling Crown Industries. He knew the name. Everybody in private aviation knew the name. Victoria Sterling had inherited her father's company at 31, had grown it into something that generated over $4 billion in annual revenue, and had a reputation for making contractors cry. He almost didn't pick up, but he thought about the lease notice sitting on his desk. He thought about the suppliers who'd been patient, who were about to stop being patient. He thought about Maya, 11 years old, sitting at the kitchen table the night before with her math homework, asking him if they were going to have to move again. He picked up the phone. That was 43 days ago. Malcolm showered in the airfield locker room, changed into a clean shirt, and laid the invoice out one more time on the passenger seat of his truck before he drove to the executive terminal. He'd been over it 60 times. He knew every line item. He knew exactly what he'd spent, exactly what his team had billed, and exactly what the contract entitled him to charge. $286,400. Not a dollar invented. Not a penny padded. He had receipts, purchase orders, labor logs, and Rachel Kim's inspection reports organized in a 3-ring binder that weighed 6 pounds. He walked into the building. The receptionist recognized him. She'd seen him come and go for 6 weeks, and smiled with the slightly sad look of someone who already knew something you didn't. "She's ready for you, Mr. Hayes." Victoria Sterling's conference room on the 4th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the airfield. Malcolm could see Hangar 7 from where he stood. He could see the jet. Victoria was already seated at the head of the table when he walked in. 3 executives lined the right side, 2 attorneys on the left, an assistant in the corner with a laptop. Nobody offered Malcolm a chair. He stood. He opened the binder. "The restoration is complete," he said. "Final systems check was performed yesterday evening. Captain Mercer's team can begin their pre-flight review at any time. Here is the itemized invoice." He walked to the head of the table and slid it to Victoria. She picked it up. She looked at it. And then, to Malcolm's disbelief and to the visible discomfort of at least two people in the room, she laughed. It wasn't a small laugh. It wasn't the polite laugh of someone buying time to think. It was the full, incredulous laugh of a woman who had decided before she even finished reading that what she was looking at was a joke. $286,000, she said, setting the invoice down and leaning back in her chair. Malcolm, you actually submitted this number. That is the number the contract entitles me to bill, Malcolm said. Along with reimbursement for components I personally advanced when your procurement department delayed purchase orders. Your components. Yes, ma'am. $79,400 in parts that kept your aircraft on schedule. Receipts are in the binder tab 3. She didn't open the binder. She looked at her attorneys, then at her executives. And something passed through that room, a decision that had clearly already been made before Malcolm ever walked through the door. Malcolm, she said, and her voice changed. It became something smooth and deliberate, the voice of someone who'd had this conversation before and knew exactly where it ended. I've had 3 of my aviation consultants review the scope of work on this aircraft. All right. They believe the appropriate market rate for this restoration, given the size of the operation, the experience level of the personnel and the facilities involved, is considerably lower than what you've submitted. Malcolm kept his face still. What number did they give you? Victoria folded her hands on the table. 45,000. The room was quiet. Malcolm looked at her. He looked at the binder. He looked out the window at the aircraft sitting in the hangar. Every system he'd rebuilt. Every component he'd hunted down. Every night he'd slept on that cot to make sure nothing slipped through. $45,000, he said. Which I think is quite generous, Victoria said. Given that Hayes Aero Works is frankly a second-tier operation. You don't have the certifications, the facility size, or the staff of the firms that typically handle aircraft at this level. You got this contract because nobody else would touch it on the timeline I needed. That's the market reality. I have every certification required by the FAA for this class of aircraft, Malcolm said. And the 3 firms that wouldn't touch it are the same ones who couldn't figure out the hydraulic failure that grounded it in the first place. Be that as it may. She shrugged. One shoulder, like the conversation was already over. I'm offering you $45,000. I'd encourage you to accept it. I'm not going to accept it. Malcolm, my invoice is $286,400. That is what your contract requires you to pay. Her expression shifted. Something cooled behind her eyes. You should speak with an attorney before you decide to make this adversarial, she said. Sterling Crown has an excellent litigation team. We handle disputes with contractors regularly. These things can drag on for quite a long time, and smaller operations don't always survive the legal overhead. The room was dead quiet now. The 2 attorneys didn't move. The executives stared at the table. Malcolm looked at Victoria Sterling for a long moment. Then he closed the binder. He picked it up. He reached into his jacket pocket, removed the hangar access key, the same key he'd carried for 43 days, and placed it on the table in front of her. The hangar is secure, he said. The maintenance log is current through yesterday's inspection. My signature is not on the airworthiness certificate. I'll leave my contact information with your receptionist. He turned toward the door. Mr. Hayes. Her voice was sharp now, not smooth. That aircraft needs to fly on Thursday. I have meetings in New York. If you walk out of this room without signing the certificate, I won't be signing the certificate, Malcolm said. He didn't turn around. Not for 45,000, not for 286, not until every outstanding question in that maintenance log has been resolved. What outstanding question? You just said the restoration was complete. He stopped. He turned around slowly. The restoration is complete, he said. The aircraft is not ready to fly. Silence. That is not the same thing, he said. I restored every system I was contracted to restore, but during the process, I identified a component inside the directional flight control assembly that I cannot certify. The serial number does not appear in any FAA-approved manufacturer database. I flagged it in the maintenance log. I reported it to your fleet coordinator 3 weeks ago, and I received no response. Victoria's jaw tightened. You're talking about one part. I'm talking about a part that controls the directional movement of a $48 million aircraft at 40,000 feet, Malcolm said. One part in the wrong place is one too many. Other mechanics have reviewed that aircraft. Other mechanics reviewed the restoration scope. None of them opened that assembly. I did, and I'm telling you what I found. He paused. I put it in writing, 3 weeks ago. I have the email. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Victoria stood up. You're doing this because I disputed the invoice, she said. This is leverage. You're using a safety flag as financial leverage. And something crossed Malcolm Hayes's face in that moment. Not anger, not indignation. Something quieter and older than either of those things. Ms. Sterling, he said, I've been in aviation for 19 years. In 19 years, I have never not once put my signature on a certificate for an aircraft I wouldn't put my daughter on. He picked up his binder. I won't start now. He walked out. The drive back to his shop took 25 minutes. He didn't call anyone. He didn't turn on the radio. He just drove both hands on the wheel, the binder on the passenger seat. The receipts adding up in his head to a number that kept growing bigger the quieter the truck got. Rachel Kim was waiting for him when he pulled in. She was sitting on the tailgate of her own truck in the parking lot, arms crossed, reading something on her tablet. She looked up when she saw his face and immediately put the tablet down. How'd it go? She asked. She offered $45,000. Rachel stared at him. 45. She stopped. Malcolm, you're serious? She's not paying, he said. Her attorneys are already in position. She thinks I'll fold when the lease comes due. Will you? He looked at her. Did you finish pulling the documentation on that Apex Vector component? That's why I'm here. She opened her tablet and handed it to him. Malcolm looked at the screen. That's not a manufacturing record, he said. No, Rachel said. That is not a manufacturing record. That is a record of a component that was listed as destroyed in a quality control rejection in 2019. She paused. And then it ended up inside a $48 million jet. Malcolm handed the tablet back. How many Apex Vector components are in that aircraft? He asked. In the manifest, she gave us 4. In the aircraft, Rachel's voice went flat. I counted 11. Malcolm was quiet for a moment. She doesn't know, he said. Not a question. Somebody knows, Rachel said. It's not her. But somebody in her procurement chain definitely knows. Malcolm walked into the shop. He sat down at his desk, a real desk this time, not the cot, and pulled out his phone. He had 12 missed calls, 3 from suppliers, 1 from his bank, 1 from his hangar landlord, 2 from Victoria Sterling's executive assistant, and 1 from Maya's school. He called Maya's school back first. The office administrator told him Maya had missed 2 days this week, and could he please speak with his daughter about attendance. Malcolm thanked her, hung up, and sat still for a moment. Maya wasn't missing school because she was careless. Maya was missing school because she'd noticed the equipment. Malcolm had been quietly moving out of the shop over the past week, quietly selling off, trying to keep the suppliers happy and the lights on while Sterling Crown sat on his money. She was missing school because she was scared. He picked up his phone and called her. She answered on the first ring. Dad? Hey, baby. You're back from the meeting. I'm back. A pause. She was 11, but she had her mother's instincts. She could read silence like a book. She didn't pay you. It wasn't a question either. Not yet, he said. But she's not going to, Maya said, and her voice was steady. Too steady for 11. The kind of steady that hurt a father more than crying would have. We're going to be fine, Malcolm said. Are we going to lose the hangar? He closed his eyes. No. Are you sure? I was not sure. He was not remotely sure. He had $200 in the business account and a lease payment due in 18 days and a binder full of receipts for $69,400 he'd spent out of his own pocket on a woman who laughed at his invoice. I'm sure, he said. Okay, Maya said. Dad, yeah. Was the plane safe when you fixed it? Was it safe? He opened his eyes. He looked at the binder on the desk. He thought about the apex vector component, about the serial number that didn't match, about what Rachel had said. 11 components. Documented destruction in 2019. Inside a jet that was supposed to fly to New York on Thursday. No, he said. And then, because she was his daughter and she deserved the truth, that's why I walked away. He heard her exhale. Good, she said quietly. Good, Dad. Thursday morning came. Victoria Sterling arrived at the private airfield at 6:45 a.m. in a black SUV with her assistant and 2 executives. The aircraft had been towed out of the hangar the evening before. It sat on the tarmac, looking immaculate, every surface polished, every system restored, the sunrise bouncing off its white fuselage like a promise. Captain Daniel Mercer arrived at 7:10. He was 56 years old, with 31 years in commercial and private aviation. He had flown for 3 different corporate clients before coming to Sterling Crown, and he had turned down more money than most people earned in a year to stay with Charles Sterling and then with Victoria, because he trusted the aircraft he flew and the people who maintained them. He walked up the air stairs. He sat in the left seat. He opened the maintenance logbook. He found the last entry dated 2 days ago. He found the discrepancy flag that Malcolm had filed 3 weeks ago and never had resolved. He found the line where an airworthiness signature should have been. Empty. Daniel Mercer sat in that cockpit for about 4 minutes. Then he stood up, collected his flight bag, walked back down the air stairs, and crossed the tarmac toward Victoria Sterling, who was standing with her coffee and her phone, and the efficient expression of a woman who had a schedule to keep. Captain, she said without looking up, we're wheels up at 8:15. We're not flying this morning, Ms. Sterling, Daniel said. She looked up from her phone. Excuse me. Malcolm Hayes's signature is not in the maintenance log. There is an unresolved discrepancy in the directional flight control assembly. I'm not flying it. Her expression went very still. Daniel, I need to be in New York. I understand that. This aircraft was completely restored. The work was finished. The work may be finished, Daniel said. The certification isn't. And I don't fly uncertified aircraft. Malcolm Hayes is in a dispute with this company over his invoice. With respect, Daniel said, that has nothing to do with the maintenance log. His flag is in writing, the discrepancy is unresolved, and there's no signature on the airworthiness certificate. Those are facts independent of any financial dispute. Victoria stared at him. Are you seriously going to let a mechanic's business argument ground my aircraft? I'm going to let an unresolved safety discrepancy ground your aircraft, Daniel said. The mechanic's business argument is your problem, not mine. He picked up his flight bag. I'm sorry, he said, and he meant it. I'll be at the terminal when this gets resolved. He walked away. Victoria stood on the tarmac. She called her co-pilot. He'd already heard from Daniel. He declined. She called her backup pilot, a contractor she kept on retainer for exactly this kind of situation. He asked about the maintenance log. She told him it was a contractor dispute, nothing safety-related. He said he'd need to see the log himself before he could make a decision. She arranged access. He looked at the log for 11 minutes. He called back and told her he wouldn't fly it. She offered him double his normal rate. He said no. By 10 o'clock, Victoria Sterling had contacted 6 pilots, 6 different men, some of whom she'd worked with for years, some of whom she'd never met, some of whom she'd offered extraordinary money. Every single one of them had said no. Not because they knew Malcolm. Not because they were coordinating. Not because they were making a statement. Because the log was the log. The discrepancy was the discrepancy. And Malcolm Hayes's name, the absence of his name on the certificate, was apparently enough of an answer by itself. She stood in the executive terminal, phone in hand, the New York flight already a memory, and said to no one in particular, "Who is this man?" Her assistant, young and careful, said nothing. But one of her executives, an older man named Gerald, who'd been with Sterling Crown for 14 years, looked up from his laptop. "He's the mechanic who wouldn't sign," Gerald said. "I know that." "No," Gerald said carefully. "I mean, that's his reputation, in private aviation. He's the mechanic who wouldn't sign." He paused. That's not an insult. That's how people know him. He's walked off 3 contracts in 20 years because he found something he wasn't comfortable with. Every time he was right. Victoria looked at him. Why? She said slowly. Did no one tell me this before we hired him? Gerald said nothing. Because the answer was, someone had. And she hadn't listened. Jaw. She called Malcolm at 10:47 a.m. He answered. I need you to come back, she said. I'm not coming back, he said. Malcolm, pay my team what they're owed. Open the Apex Vector question with your fleet coordinator. And let me resolve the discrepancy properly without a deadline. I have a board meeting in New York on Friday. Then you should have paid me on Monday, he said. And his voice wasn't angry. That was the thing she couldn't quite process. There was no anger in it. There was something more difficult than anger. There was certainty. Ms. Sterling, I'm not playing a game with you. I'm not using the aircraft as leverage. I need you to understand something. Then help me understand it, she snapped. I found a component inside your directional flight control system that does not exist in any legitimate supply chain, he said. If that component fails at cruising altitude, and depending on its wear condition, you would lose partial directional control of a $48 million aircraft with people on board. That is not a billing dispute. That is a matter of life and death. The line was quiet. You should have people look at your other aircraft, Malcolm said, before you worry about mine. What other aircraft? That's the question I'd be asking your procurement department, he said. Specifically ask them about Apex Vector Aviation. Ask them how many of your fleet aircraft contain Apex Vector components, and then ask them to show you the certification documentation for each one. Another silence. I'll be at my shop, Malcolm said. When you're ready to have a real conversation about what I found, I'm here. He hung up. Victoria Sterling stood in the executive terminal of her own private airfield, her $48 million jet, sitting grounded on the tarmac outside, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt something she'd nearly forgotten the texture of. She felt afraid. Not of losing money, not of missing the New York meeting. Afraid that the man she'd laughed at, the quiet black single father in the clean shirt with the heavy binder, the one she'd offered $45,000 and a courtroom, might have been the most important person in the room. And she had put him out the door. Back at Hayes Aero Works. Malcolm sat at his desk and stared at the wall. Rachel Kim leaned in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one. How many aircraft does Sterling Crown operate? She asked. 11, Malcolm said. How many could have Apex Vector parts? Malcolm looked at his notes. Based on the procurement dates, could be as many as 5. Rachel was quiet for a moment. You know she's going to fight you on this. She might, Malcolm said. She's going to say you're making it bigger than it is to justify the invoice. She already said that. And? He drank the coffee. And I found what I found, he said simply. What she does with it is up to her. Rachel nodded. She looked out the shop window at the parking lot, at the spaces where 2 pieces of equipment used to sit before Malcolm had sold them last week. At the trucks. At the hangar that still had his name on the door, though, for how much longer was an open question. What are you going to do if she doesn't pay? Rachel asked. Malcolm thought about Maya, about the phone call that morning, about the steady 2-adult voice saying, Are we going to lose the hangar? Keep working, he said. On what? You've got no active contracts. I'll find something. He looked at her. I always do. Rachel studied him for a moment. You know what the crazy part is, she said. What? If she'd just paid you on Monday, Rachel said, you'd have signed the certificate and walked away. You wouldn't have said another word about Apex Vector. You'd have filed the flag and the maintenance log noted it as a client declined resolution and let it go. Malcolm thought about that. Yeah, he said quietly. I probably would have. But she laughed at you. She laughed at the invoice, he said. And then she refused to deal with the safety flag. And that combination... He stopped. He set down the coffee cup. That combination told me something about the culture inside that company. And when I went back and looked at what Rachel found at those 11 components at the procurement records... He shook his head. This isn't a billing dispute anymore. It hasn't been a billing dispute for a while. He picked up the binder, opened it to tab 7, laid it flat on the desk. Someone in Victoria Sterling's company has been buying aircraft components from a supplier with a junk certification history, marking them up and installing them in aircraft that carry human beings, he said. And the reason nobody caught it, he looked at Rachel, is because Victoria Sterling didn't think operational details were worth her time. She inherited an aviation program and never looked at it. Until now, Rachel said. Until now. Malcolm agreed. He closed the binder. Outside the shop window, a car pulled into the parking lot. A black SUV. No driver. Just one person in the back. Malcolm watched it park. He watched the door open. And Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Crown Industries, billionaire, the woman who had laughed at his invoice 43 hours ago, stepped out of the car alone. No assistant. No attorneys. No executives. She walked toward the door of Hayes Aero Works. Malcolm didn't move. Rachel looked at him. "Should I?" "Get another cup of coffee," Malcolm said. "This is going to be a long conversation." Victoria Sterling had never knocked on a mechanic's door in her life. She knocked anyway. Malcolm watched her through the shop window for 3 full seconds before he moved. He'd been sitting at his desk with the Apex Vector binder open in front of him and a cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow. And when that black SUV pulled into his lot without a driver, without assistance, without the full court press of attorneys and executives she'd brought to every previous interaction, something in his gut shifted. Not softened. Just shifted. Because a woman like Victoria Sterling didn't go anywhere alone. That was a statement. He just wasn't sure yet what it was saying. Rachel had already disappeared into the back of the shop. Malcolm stood up, straightened his shirt, and opened the door. Victoria looked different outside her conference room. Still polished, she would never not be polished, but something around her eyes was wrong. Not wrong like grief. Wrong like a person who'd been running at full speed and suddenly found there was no more ground in front of them. "Malcolm," she said. "Ms. Sterling." She looked past him into the shop. At the workbenches. At the equipment, some of it still there, some of the spaces where equipment used to be noticeably empty, the clean floor where machines once sat, leaving their absence like a bruise. "Can I come in?" she asked. He stepped aside. She walked in and stopped in the middle of the floor, and for a moment she just looked around. Not with contempt this time, with something closer to attention, like she was actually seeing it for the first time. "You've been selling equipment," she said. "Paying suppliers," he said. "They don't wait." She turned to face him. "I know I owe you money, Malcolm." "You owe my team money," he said. Rachel Kim worked 80 hours on that aircraft. David Torres worked 63. My apprentice, a 22-year-old kid named Jerome, worked 41 hours, including 2 overnight shifts. He paused. "They have bills too." Victoria absorbed that. She didn't deflect it. That he noticed. "I came to talk," she said. "I know why you came," he said. 6 pilots told you no." Her jaw tightened slightly. 7, actually, as of an hour ago. Malcolm didn't say anything. He gestured toward the 2 chairs he kept near his desk, the ones for clients, not for adversaries, and after a moment, they both sat down. "Tell me about the component," she said. And so he told her. He pulled out tab 4 in the binder and walked her through it the way he would have walked her through it in that conference room if she'd given him the chance 43 hours earlier. The Directional Flight Control Assembly. The serial number that didn't appear in the FAA registry. The rejection documentation he'd found through Rachel's research, a 2019 quality control record from the original manufacturer showing that a batch of components had been flagged and destroyed due to material inconsistencies in the alloy composition. Except they hadn't been destroyed. At least one of them had ended up in a Sterling Crown aircraft. Victoria listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't look out the window. She listened the way people listen when they've stopped performing listening and started actually doing it. "One component," she said when he finished. "In your jet," he said. "In the aircraft I was hired to restore. That's the one I know about with certainty." He paused and looked at her. But I contracted to restore one aircraft, Mrs. Sterling. I didn't audit your fleet. What are you saying? He opened tab 7. I'm saying that Apex Vector Aviation has been supplying your procurement department for at least 4 years, he said, based on the invoice records Rachel pulled. And I want to be clear, these are records your fleet coordinator provided us during the contract. Records we needed to match against the aircraft's maintenance history. Apex Vector components appear in purchase orders across your entire operation. He laid the page in front of her. She looked at it, and he watched her face change. Not dramatically. Victoria Sterling didn't do dramatic in the way most people did dramatic. It was a small change, a slight tightening around the eyes, a stillness that replaced the controlled composure she'd walked in with. Like something behind the mask had just heard something terrible. How many aircraft? She asked. I don't know, he said. Could be 3, could be 6. I've only seen the one, and I've only pulled the procurement data for your primary airframe. To answer your question properly, you'd need an independent inspection of your entire fleet. That would ground everything. Yes, he said. That would cost me. She stopped herself, took a breath. A significant amount of money. More than $286,000, he said simply. The room was quiet. Outside, a truck pulled past on the street. Inside, the shop hummed with the ambient sound of a building that was working even when the work was in pause. My father used this airfield, Victoria said suddenly. Malcolm looked at her. He used Sterling Crown's hangar on the south end, she said. This was years ago before he built the executive terminal. He used to walk the flight line in the mornings. She paused. He knew people here. Yes, ma'am, Malcolm said carefully. Did he know you? A beat. He knew my work. Something passed across her face. Captain Mercer told me something this morning, she said. Before I drove here. He said my father had a rule. Malcolm said nothing. He said Charles Sterling had a rule about aircraft maintenance, she said. He said if Malcolm Hayes won't sign it, nobody flies it. She looked at him directly. That was the rule. My father's rule. About you specifically. The silence between them was different now. Heavier. Like something old had just surfaced. I didn't know that, Malcolm said. And it was true. He'd worked with Charles Sterling twice. The second time had been the one that mattered, the fuel system, the defect. The day Charles had tried to pressure him, and Malcolm had refused. And 3 days later, the manufacturer had confirmed everything Malcolm said. After that, Charles had shaken his hand without another word and walked away. Malcolm had never known what the man thought or said or did with it after that. I found the records, Victoria said. After Daniel told me, I went through my father's aviation files. She looked at the binder on the desk. He kept notes about every maintenance facility he worked with, every inspector, every decision. She paused. He wrote about you. Malcolm waited. He wrote that you were the most expensive mechanic he'd ever almost used. Wrong, she said. And the most valuable one he'd ever listened to. She paused again. He also wrote that if a man won't bend on safety, don't try to bend him. Just get out of the way. Malcolm looked at the wall for a moment. I didn't work for your father again after that second job, he said. I thought he was angry. I wasn't angry, Victoria said. He was embarrassed. There's a difference. She looked at her hands. I'm familiar with the feeling. Something in that admission cost her. He could see it. And he didn't make it easier for her, and he didn't make it harder. He just let it sit. Ms. Sterling, he said after a moment, why did you offer me $45,000? She looked up. Not as a negotiating position, he said. Not as a legal strategy. I want to know what you actually thought when you looked at that invoice. What you actually believed. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might deflect. But she didn't. I thought you were taking advantage of the situation, she said. I thought that you'd been given access to a very expensive aircraft, that you'd been given a contract with some flexibility and scope, and that when you saw the final number, you decided to push it as high as you could, because you needed money, and I could absorb the loss. She paused. I thought you were doing what I assumed someone in your position would do. Someone in my position, Malcolm said. She didn't look away. Yes. What position is that? She held his gaze. A struggling business owner who needed this contract to survive, she said. And I thought that meant, she stopped. That I would compromise, he said. Yes. Because I needed the money. Yes. He nodded slowly. Not in forgiveness. Not in acceptance. Just in acknowledgement that they were finally saying the real thing. Ms. Sterling, he said. In my experience, the people who compromise on safety are the ones who have too much to lose, not the ones who have too little. He let that land. I've got a daughter and a shop and a reputation built over 19 years. You couldn't have paid me enough to put those things at risk. But you also couldn't have threatened me enough. Because the moment I compromise, once the moment I sign something I know isn't right, everything I've built means nothing. The certificate is only worth what it costs me to refuse signing it. Victoria was very still. I didn't understand that, she said quietly. I know, he said. She picked up the tab 7 page and looked at it again. Her eyes moved across the procurement records, the way his eyes moved across a maintenance log, carefully, systematically, like she was looking for something she could fix. What would you do, she said, if you were in my position? If you found out that someone inside your operation had been running a procurement fraud for 4 years and you'd been too distracted to catch it, what would you do? Malcolm thought about it, really thought about it the way he thought about a problem in an aircraft, not emotionally, but structurally. Where does the failure originate? Where does it branch? What has to come out before the system can be trusted again? I'd ground the fleet, he said. All of it, today. She closed her eyes briefly. I'd bring in an independent inspection team, he said. Not your people. Outside people with no relationship to your procurement chain. And I'd tell them to find everything, not just the Apex Vector components. Because if the culture was loose enough to let one supplier run counterfeit parts into your aircraft, it was loose enough for other problems too. And the cost doesn't matter, he said. Ms. Sterling, if one of your other aircraft goes down because you knew there was a problem and didn't ground the fleet. He stopped. You know what that looks like. She opened her eyes. And for the first time since she'd walked into his shop, he saw something in her face that wasn't composure and wasn't calculation. It was fear. Real fear. The kind that has nothing to do with money or reputation, and everything to do with the sudden concrete understanding of what could happen to real human beings in a real aircraft at real altitude. I need to make some calls, she said. I know. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She looked at Malcolm. I'll have my finance department wire your full invoice amount today, she said. With the advances and interest. I'll need your banking information. Rachel has it, he said. She's in the back. Victoria nodded. She took 2 steps towards the back of the shop, then stopped. Malcolm. She didn't turn around. The pilots who refused this morning, 7 of them. A pause. I offered the last 3 significant bonuses. We're talking about amounts that would have changed the financial situation for most people. I know, he said. They still said no. Now she turned. Because of your signature. Because your name wasn't in the log. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. I want you to understand what that means, because I don't think you fully appreciate it. He waited. In 30 years of business, she said, I have had lawyers, executives, consultants, and board members tell me what they thought I wanted to hear. I have had people worth 10 times what you are worth tell me yes when they should have told me no. I have paid people enormous amounts of money, and they still managed to disappoint me. She paused. And you, with everything you had on the line, you put the key on the table and walked out. I was raised a certain way, he said. So was I, she said. It didn't stick the same way. She went to find Rachel. Malcolm sat back down at his desk. He picked up his cold coffee and looked at it. Put it back down. His phone buzzed. A text from Maya. Did she pay you? He typed back, working on it. 3 dots appeared. Then, that means no. He almost smiled. He typed, that means almost. The dots again. Then Dad. I told Mrs. Patterson you'd come to career day. He looked at the ceiling. When he typed, 2 weeks. She wants a real job. Not a school job. Aviation maintenance is a real job. I told her that. She said, bring documentation. He did smile this time. Just briefly. I'll bring the binder, he typed. Don't bring the binder. It's 400 pages. 312. Dad. He put the phone down. The smile faded. He looked at the shop, at what remained of it, at the empty spaces at the workbenches where his team had spent weeks building something worth building. He thought about Jerome, 22 years old, who'd worked 2 overnight shifts and never once complained, who'd asked Malcolm intelligent questions about tolerances and material fatigue that most mechanics twice his age wouldn't know to ask. I thought about what it would mean if the invoice wire cleared today. About the suppliers he could pay. About the equipment he might be able to get back. About the lease that had 18 days left on its grace period. He thought about what it would mean if it didn't clear. Then Rachel appeared in the doorway. It's done, she said. Authorization went through. Should hit the account within the hour. Malcolm exhaled. Not dramatically. Just exhaled. Like a pressure valve, slow and controlled. Because that was who he was. Okay, he said. 286.4, Rachel said. Plus the advances, plus late interest. She added something extra, a discretionary amount. Rachel looked at her phone. She said, and I'm reading directly, for the inconvenience of having to deal with me. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. Her words, Rachel said. Pay the suppliers first, he said. Already on it. Jerome first. He's been waiting the longest. Done. He nodded. He looked at the binder one more time. Rachel, I need you to help me build a full documentation package on the Apex Vector findings. Not just the one component. Everything you pulled. The rejection records, the procurement invoices, the installation history. Everything organized so a federal investigator can pick it up and understand it inside of 30 minutes. Rachel looked at him carefully. Are you reporting it? Victoria is grounding her fleet today, he said. When the inspection teams go into those aircraft, they're going to find what we found. Probably more. And when that happens, the FAA is going to want a full record of when this was discovered, and by whom. He paused. I want our documentation to be the first thing they see. That could start a federal investigation, Rachel said. Probably will, he agreed. Into Sterling Crown. Into Apex Vector, he said. Sterling Crown is the customer. Apex Vector is the supplier. The question is, who knew when they knew it, and whether they kept doing it after they knew. He looked at her. That's not our investigation to run. But we found it. We have an obligation to document what we found. Rachel studied him for a long moment. You know this is going to make things complicated, she said. They're already complicated, he said. More complicated. Then we document it more carefully, he said. She shook her head, not in disagreement, in something closer to admiration, and went back to her workstation. Malcolm sat in the quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Daniel Mercer. The captain answered on the second ring. Mr. Hayes. Captain Mercer, I understand Ms. Sterling spoke with you this morning. She did, Daniel said. She told me about your father's rule, Malcolm said. I didn't know. A pause on the line. Charles was a private man. He didn't advertise his opinions. He apparently wrote them down, though. He wrote everything down, Daniel said. 30 years of aviation, every aircraft, every facility, every mechanic he trusted, and everyone he didn't. He was meticulous. A pause. He had your name on a very short list. Malcolm was quiet. The list was titled, People Who Will Tell You the Truth, Daniel said. There were 4 names on it. 2 have retired. 1 died. You're the last one still working. The weight of that settled on Malcolm in a way he hadn't expected. Not pride. Something more like responsibility. I need to ask you something, Malcolm said. Off the record. Go ahead. When you refused to fly this morning, all 7 of you, were you coordinating? Did someone make calls? Daniel was quiet for a moment. No, he said. Not explicitly. I told my co-pilot what I found in the log. He made his own decision. The others, I don't know who they spoke to. But the log is the log, Malcolm. An unresolved safety flag and no signature. There's only one answer to that, regardless of who owns the aircraft. 7 pilots, Malcolm said. She offered bonuses. I know what she offered. And none of you. When you've been flying for 30 years, Daniel said, you stop being afraid of money. You start being afraid of the things money can't fix. A pause. An aircraft is a machine. Machines fail. The only thing standing between failure and catastrophe is the person who signed the logbook and the reputation behind that signature. Your reputation. Malcolm, is that you don't sign things you're not certain of. Another pause. We were certain you weren't certain. That was enough. Malcolm stared at his desk. I'm going to resolve the discrepancy, he said. Properly this time. Victoria has agreed to let me open the assembly without a deadline. Good, Daniel said. Tell me when you're ready to put eyes on the logbook. I'd like to be there. They hung up. The wire hit the account 40 minutes later. Malcolm looked at the number on his phone. He looked at it for a while. He called his bank and confirmed it. He transferred the supplier payments. He transferred Jerome's payment and David's and Rachel's. He transferred his lease payment with 8 days to spare. When he was done, he looked at what remained in the account. It wasn't enough to buy back the equipment he'd sold, but it was enough to order it new. He put the phone down and looked at his shop. At the name above the door, Hayes Aero Works, still there, still his. He thought about how close it had come. He thought about Maya asking, "Are we going to lose the hangar?" in that steady, too-old voice. He thought about his wife gone 5 years now, and whether she would have recognized him in that conference room, standing in front of a woman twice his net worth, with a hangar key in his hand, and not 1 ounce of surrender in his posture. I thought she would have. He thought she would have been quietly furious on his behalf, and then quietly proud in the order she always handled those two things. His phone rang again. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He answered. Is this Hayes Aero Works? A man's voice. Older, careful. This is Malcolm Hayes. Mr. Hayes, my name is Frank Delgado. I'm a senior investigator with the FAA Civil Aviation Security Division. I've been made aware of some documentation related to a Sterling Crown aircraft in the Dallas area. I was told you might be the person to speak with. Malcolm's hand tightened slightly on the phone. He hadn't reported anything yet. Rachel hadn't finished the documentation package. Victoria had left less than 2 hours ago. Who told you to call me? He asked. A pause on the line. Captain Daniel Mercer, Frank Delgado said. He said if there's a man in Dallas who found something real, it's you. And he said whatever you found, you documented it properly. Another pause. Did you? Malcolm looked at the binder. At 312 pages of dates, serial numbers, procurement records, and rejection documentation. At the truth organized and indexed and impossible to misread. Yes, he said. I documented it properly. Can we meet? When? As soon as possible, Frank said. Mr. Hayes, I need you to understand something. What you may have found in that aircraft isn't isolated. We've had reports from 2 other states in the past 8 months about Apex Vector components appearing in private aviation supply chains. We've been trying to trace the distribution network. He paused. If your documentation is what Captain Mercer believes it is, you may have just given us the thread we've been looking for. Malcolm sat back in his chair. He thought about the 11 components, about the 2019 rejection records, about the procurement invoices spanning 4 years and multiple aircraft. He thought about an aircraft at 40,000 feet with a component inside it that should have been destroyed 7 years ago. Mr. Delgado, he said, I'll be at my shop all afternoon. Come whenever you're ready. He hung up. Then he stood up, walked to the back of the shop, and put his head in the doorway where Rachel was working. Build the package, he said. Everything, as fast as you can. Rachel looked up. Why? What happened? The FAA is coming, he said. She stared at him. Today, he said. She turned back to her workstation and started typing faster. Malcolm walked back to his desk. He sat down. He looked at the binder. He thought about what Daniel had said. People who will tell you the truth. 4 names. 3 gone. He picked up the binder and opened it to page 1. He started reading from the beginning, not because he didn't know what was in it, but because he wanted to be certain. Absolutely, irrevocably certain, the way he was always certain before he put his name on something. Because his name meant something. It always had. And for the first time in a long time, the rest of the world was beginning to understand exactly why. Frank Delgado arrived at Hayes Aeroworks at 3:47 in the afternoon, driving a plain government sedan that looked like it had logged enough miles to have its own retirement plan. He was a compact man in his early 60s, gray at the temples, with the kind of unhurried movements that belonged to someone who had learned a long time ago that urgency and speed were not the same thing. He shook Malcolm's hand, looked around the shop once without comment, and accepted the cup of coffee Rachel offered him without any of the performative reluctance some federal people showed when they were trying to establish authority. He sat down across from Malcolm's desk, put a manila folder on the table, and said, "Show me what you've got." Malcolm laid the binder open between them. He didn't walk Delgado through it, the way he'd walked Victoria through it. Not step by step, not building toward a conclusion. He just turned to tab 4 and let the investigator read. And Frank Delgado read the way Malcolm had hoped he would read thoroughly, without interrupting, turning pages at a pace that suggested he wasn't skimming, wasn't looking for headlines. He was reading the actual data. After 11 minutes, Delgado looked up. "The 2019 rejection record," he said. "Where did you source this FAA component traceability database?" Malcolm said. "Rachel Kim, my avionics specialist, pulled it using the serial number. The component in the aircraft is listed under batch number 7741C. That entire batch was flagged for alloy composition failure and was supposed to be destroyed before it entered any supply chain." "Supposed to be," Delgado said. "Supposed to be," Malcolm agreed. Delgado turned to tab 7. He looked at the Apex Vector procurement records for a long time. His expression didn't change exactly, but something around his eyes got very focused and very still. The way a hunting dog goes still when it catches a scent. It's been following for a long time. "Mr. Hayes," he said quietly, "how long have you been in private aviation?" 19 years. "Have you worked with Apex Vector components before this contract?" "Seen them in 2 other aircraft over the years," Malcolm said. "Both times the documentation looked legitimate. I had no reason to question them. But this time the serial number didn't match," Malcolm said. "Not a red flag I was looking for, just something that happened to catch my eye because I cross-reference every part number against the manufacturer database when I'm doing a full restoration. Some mechanics don't. I do." Delgado nodded slowly. He closed the binder, but he kept his hand on it, like he didn't want to let it get far. "I'm going to tell you something, Mr. Hayes," he said. "And I'm telling you this, not because I owe you an explanation, but because what you found deserves context." He paused. "Apex Vector Aviation has been on our radar for 22 months. We have reports from facilities in Nevada and Georgia, and now from you in Texas. Parts appearing in supply chains that shouldn't exist. Documentation that looks clean on the surface, but doesn't hold up when you chase the original manufacture records." He looked at Malcolm directly. "In 22 months we have had 0 documentation packages solid enough to take anywhere. Every report we've gotten has been verbal. Recollections. I thought the serial number looked wrong. Something felt off. Nothing written, nothing organized, nothing that a federal case could be built on." He put his hand on the binder again. "This," he said, "is 312 pages of organized sourced cross-referenced documentation with primary source records attached." Rachel Kim, standing in the doorway of the back office, said nothing, but Malcolm saw her exhale. "What does that mean for the investigation?" Malcolm asked. "It means," Delgado said carefully, "that we now have a thread, and our job, my job, is to pull it." He paused. "Which is going to require your cooperation, not just today, going forward." "What kind of cooperation?" "Testimony," Delgado said. "Your records, your documentation process, a deposition, possibly multiple. And I want your team, Ms. Kim, specifically available to walk our technical staff through how she accessed and verified these records so we can establish the methodology in a legal context." Malcolm looked at Rachel. She gave him a single nod. Not enthusiastic, not reluctant, just yes. All right, Malcolm said. Delgado picked up the binder. I'll need to take this. That's a copy, Malcolm said. Rachel made 4. 1 for you, 1 for us, 1 for Sterling Crown's insurance carrier, and 1 in a secure location off-site. Delgado looked at him. I've been in business 19 years, Malcolm said. I know how documentation works. For the first time, the investigator almost smiled. He stood up, tucked the binder under his arm, and picked up his manila folder from the table. He'd never opened it, Malcolm realized. Whatever was in it, he'd come in with information he already had, and left with information he needed. Ms. Sterling grounded her fleet this afternoon, Delgado said at the door. All 11 aircraft. She called our Dallas field office before she called her own board. He paused. That was the right call. It's also the kind of call that, in my experience, people only make when someone has given them a very clear picture of what's at stake. He looked at Malcolm. You gave her that picture. He left. The shop was quiet for a moment after the door closed. Then Rachel walked in from the doorway and sat down in the chair Delgado had just vacated. She put her elbows on her knees and looked at the desk where the binder had been sitting. 19 years, she said. Yeah. And it took a woman refusing to pay your invoice to start a federal investigation. Malcolm looked at her. She didn't start it, he said. Delgado said it's been running for 22 months. She just... He stopped. She gave you a reason to document everything, Rachel said. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. She did. His phone buzzed. Maya. He looked at the screen. Dad. Mrs. Patterson said you can bring a model airplane to career day. He stared at that for a second. Then he typed, Tell her I'll bring something better. The 3 dots. Then, what's better than a model airplane? He put the phone back down. He looked at the empty space on his desk, where the binder had been sitting for the past 3 days, where the documentation he'd built page by careful page in between supplier calls and lease threats, and a daughter asking whether they were going to lose the hangar, where all of that had just walked out the door in a federal investigator's hands. He felt lighter than he expected to feel. Not relieved, not victorious, just lighter, like something he'd been carrying had been accepted by someone whose job it was to carry it. He picked up his phone and called Daniel Mercer back. The captain answered on the first ring. He came, Malcolm said. He took the documentation. Good. He told me something, Malcolm said. He said Victoria called the FAA's Dallas field office before she called her own board. A pause. Did you know she was going to do that? Silence on the line. Captain, Malcolm said. I may have suggested, Daniel said carefully, that the appropriate sequence of calls when you discover a potential federal aviation safety violation is to notify the regulatory authority before you notify your lawyers, because lawyers protect the company. The FAA protects the aircraft. Malcolm thought about that. You told her that. I mentioned it, Daniel said. This morning, before you met with her. You were setting the table, Malcolm said. I was being helpful, Daniel said, in the way that people who have seen these situations before can be helpful. A pause. I've been flying for 31 years, Malcolm. I have watched 3 corporate aviation programs come apart from the inside because someone decided the legal exposure was more important than the safety exposure. It never ends well, and it always ends worse than it would have if they'd just done the right thing on day 1. She did the right thing, Malcolm said. Late, but she did it. People usually do, Daniel said, when they finally understand what the wrong thing would actually cost them. Not in money, in the other currency. A pause. The one you can't get back. Malcolm understood what he meant. He didn't need it elaborated. They talked for another few minutes about the technical side, about what the independent inspection team would need, about whether Malcolm would be the right person to lead the evaluation of the primary aircraft, or whether an independent third party should take it entirely, about the sequence of events once the FAA formally opened their investigation. When they hung up, it was past 5 in the afternoon. Rachel had gone home. The shop was quiet and clean, the way it always was, at end of day every tool in its place. Every surface wiped down the habits of a disciplined operation, maintained even through the weeks when everything had been tilting. Malcolm turned off the shop lights one by one. He stood in the doorway for a moment in the near dark, looking at Hayes Aero Works from the inside out. It was still there. That still meant something. He locked up and drove home. Maya was at the kitchen table when he walked in, homework spread across the surface, a half-eaten bowl of cereal pushed to the side. Her reading glasses on, even though she insisted she didn't need them for anything except very small print. He stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. She looked up. "You look different," she said. "Do I? Less tired?" He sat down across from her. He didn't explain the afternoon. He didn't tell her about Delgado, or the binder, or the 4 copies, or the 22-month investigation that now had a thread. She was 11. There would be time for the full story later, when the full story had an ending. "The invoice was paid," he said. She pushed her glasses up. "All of it. All of it. Plus the advances. Plus interest." She looked at him steadily. "And the hangar. Lease is paid," he said. 8 days early." She nodded. Once. With the particular dignity of a child who has been carrying adult worry and is now being told carefully that she can put it down. "Good," she said. She went back to her homework. He sat there for a while. Then he got up and made dinner. The next 3 days moved differently than the days before them. The weight that had been sitting on Hayes Aero Works since the invoice dispute lifted in stages, the way pressure equalizes through a system not all at once, but methodically, each component finding its correct level. Suppliers confirmed payment. Jerome came back to work with the kind of quiet relief that young people express by simply showing up early and asking for more to do. David Torres called from Austin and said he'd heard through the private aviation network that something significant was happening at Sterling Crown, and wanted to know if Malcolm needed extra hands when the fleet inspection started. Malcolm told him probably yes and probably soon. He was right on both counts. On the 3rd morning after Delgado's visit, Victoria Sterling called at 7:45. "The independent inspection team starts Monday," she said. "I want you on site." "For what capacity?" he asked. "Technical advisor," she said. "You know what you found. The inspection team is good. They're certified. They're independent. They have no relationship with my procurement department. But they're coming in cold. You've already seen the inside of one aircraft. You know what to look for." Malcolm was quiet for a moment. "I'm not a Sterling Crown employee," he said. "I know that," she said. "I'm not asking you to be. I'm asking Hayes Aero Works to provide technical consultation services to an independent fleet inspection. Separate contract. Separate billing. You report to the inspection team, not to me." A pause. "Except that I'll want a summary report when it's done, which I'll ask the inspection team to provide, which they'll get from you." He thought about it. "What about the primary aircraft?" he said. "The one I restored. The directional flight control assembly." "That's the first one," she said. "That's why I want you there Monday. I want the people opening that assembly to have you standing next to them." I thought about the component. About what Delgado had said alloy composition failure in the original batch. About what that meant in practical terms, a part that was already weak when it was manufactured, that had been sitting inside a flight control system, absorbing stress for an unknown period of time, that by the end of the restoration had logged God knows how many hours in a chain of custody that Malcolm couldn't fully trace. "Monday," he said. 7 a.m., she said. "I'll be there." She paused. Then, "Malcolm, the FAA investigator Delgado, he called me yesterday. He said your documentation was the most thorough voluntary submission his office has received from a private contractor in over a decade." Malcolm didn't say anything. "I don't know if that matters to you," she said. "It matters," he said. "Not the way you might think, but it matters." Another pause. "How does it matter?" "It matters because I built it the same way I build everything," he said. "The same way I write a maintenance log. The same way I inspect a flight control assembly. The same standard regardless of who's watching or what's at stake financially." He paused. If it's worth doing, it's worth documenting correctly. That's not a philosophy. That's just the way the job works. Victoria was quiet on the line for a moment. My father said something like that, she said. What did he say? He said the easiest way to find out who a person actually is, she said, is to watch how they do the small things. Because the big things are too visible. People perform the big things. The small things are automatic. She paused. I think he was talking about himself. A reminder. Malcolm thought about Charles Sterling writing in his aviation notebooks. 4 names on a list. People who will tell you the truth. He was a careful man, Malcolm said. I was, Victoria said. I wasn't always. She left it there. They said goodbye and hung up, and Malcolm stood in his shop for a moment with the phone in his hand, thinking about inheritance. Not the financial kind, but the other kind. The kind that comes in notebooks and aviation rules, and the muscle memory of an organization that had once been led by someone who understood what mattered, and about the gap that opens when the person who understood it is gone, and the person who follows doesn't yet know what they're missing. Monday came with a gray sky and cooler air, and the kind of morning that feels like a workday before you've even arrived. Malcolm was at the Sterling Crown Executive Airfield at 6:52, coffee in hand, his own tools in the back of his truck, wearing the same clean shirt he wore to every job that mattered. The independent inspection team was already there. 5 people from a Dallas-based aviation safety firm called Meridian Aero, with their own equipment and their own documentation protocols, and a project lead named Susan Okafor, who had been in aviation inspection for 23 years and had the focused, specific energy of someone who took the work personally. She shook Malcolm's hand and said, I've heard about you. He said, same. They went straight to work. The primary aircraft was in Hangar 2, now moved from the tarmac where it had been sitting since Thursday morning when the pilots refused. The directional flight control assembly was already tagged for priority inspection. Malcolm walked Susan's team through the restoration scope, through the maintenance log entries, through the flagged discrepancy. He did it with the same economy of language he always used, not storytelling, just information. What he found, when, how, what the cross-reference produced. Susan listened with the same quality of attention that Delgado had shown. The kind that costs something. Then they opened the assembly. What they found inside stopped the room. Not dramatically, not with anyone raising their voice or stepping back. The room went quiet in the particular way that people who understand technical systems go quiet when they see something that confirms a fear they'd been carrying. Susan leaned forward over the open assembly and looked at the component Malcolm had flagged. She looked at it for a long time. She had a magnification tool, and she used it. Then she straightened up and said, "Get Delgado on the phone." One of her team members was already moving. "What is it?" Malcolm asked. Susan looked at him. "The wear pattern on this component is consistent with metal fatigue in an improperly alloyed material," she said. "But that's what we expected based on your documentation." She paused. "What we didn't expect is that based on the stress markers, this component has been operating for considerably longer than the aircraft's maintenance log accounts for." Malcolm frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Susan said carefully, "that the wear on this part is consistent with somewhere between 800 and 1200 hours of operational stress. Your maintenance log shows this aircraft had approximately 420 hours on it since the last major inspection." She looked at him. Either this aircraft logged significantly more hours than reported, or this component was already used when it was installed. The room was completely quiet. Malcolm turned that over in his mind. A used component, not just uncertified, not just from a rejected batch, pre-stressed, already partially fatigued when someone put it into a $48 million jet and sent it into the sky. "That's not negligence," he said slowly. "No," Susan said. "That's deliberate." "Yes," Susan said. "That's deliberate." Delgado's team arrived at the airfield before noon. What followed was the kind of controlled, methodical escalation that federal investigations produce when the evidence is solid and the timeline is moving. Delgado walked through the hangar with Susan with his own technical advisor with a documentation photographer. He asked precise questions and received precise answers. At one point, he stopped next to Malcolm and said without looking at him, "This is bigger than Apex Vector." "I know," Malcolm said. "How long have you known?" Malcolm thought about it. "Since I counted 11 components in an aircraft that manifested 4, he said. "That's not a supplier substituting cheaper parts to protect a margin. That's a system." Delgado nodded. "Someone inside Sterling Crown's procurement chain was selecting aircraft for modification," he said. "Not randomly, not incidentally. Selecting specific aircraft and replacing certified components with uncertified ones in a way that would survive a standard pre-flight check, but not a deep restoration inspection." He paused. "Most of these aircraft never get a deep restoration inspection, except when 3 major firms refuse the contract and they have to find someone else," Malcolm said. "Except then," Delgado said. They stood in silence for a moment. "Who?" Malcolm said. "We have a name," Delgado said. "I can't share it, but we have a name, and we have, as of this morning, a warrant." He paused. "Thanks in part to your documentation, which established the procurement timeline with enough specificity to give us probable cause." Malcolm said nothing. "You're going to be asked to testify," Delgado said. "Formally. Grand jury possibly. Are you prepared for that?" "Yes," Malcolm said. Delgado looked at him. "It'll put your name in connection with a federal investigation. That affects business sometimes." "Everything affects business," Malcolm said. "Signing something I shouldn't sign affects business worse." Delgado nodded. He went back to his team. It was Rachel who called at 2 in the afternoon, while Malcolm was still at the airfield, watching the inspection of the second aircraft proceed. "Malcolm," she said, "we got 3 new inquiry calls this morning." He blinked. "From who?" 2 corporate aviation operators, 1 charter company. All 3 said they'd heard through the network that we were involved in the Sterling Crown inspection." She paused. "They want to know if we do fleet audits." Malcolm stood still. "We've never done fleet audits," he said. "I know," Rachel said. "I told them that. They asked if we would." He turned that over. "Tell them I'll call back this week," he said. "Malcolm," Rachel said. "These are serious operations. We're talking about—" "I know," he said. "Tell them I'll call back this week." He hung up. He turned back to the aircraft. "Inspection teams. Federal investigators. New inquiry calls. 3 new operations asking for something Hayes Aeroworks had never officially offered. All of it tracing back to a woman who laughed at an invoice and a key placed on a conference table." He thought about the mechanic who wouldn't sign. That was his reputation, Gerald had said. Not an insult, just how people knew him. He was beginning to understand what that reputation was actually worth. But the afternoon wasn't done with him yet. At 4:15, Susan Okafor found him in the hangar and said, "Come look at Aircraft 6. He followed her. Aircraft 6 was a mid-size Cessna Citation used primarily for domestic routes. Sterling Crown operated it for regional executive travel. It had been in service for 3 years since its last major inspection. On the exterior in the pre-flight visual, it looked exactly right. Inside the left engine nacelle, behind a panel that would not be opened in any standard pre-flight inspection. Susan's team had found 4 Apex Vector components in a cluster. But that wasn't what Susan wanted him to see. She pointed to a secondary component mounted adjacent to the Apex Vector cluster, a fuel system shutoff valve. She pointed to the installation bracket. "Tell me what you see," she said. Malcolm leaned in. He looked at the bracket. He looked at the mounting hardware. He looked at the clearance between the valve and the adjacent fuel line. He felt his stomach drop. "That valve was installed upside down," he said. "Yes," Susan said. "If that valve actuates in flight, it would attempt to shut off the wrong line," she said. "Under pressure with the force the system generates, the most probable outcome is a rupture at the connector junction." She paused. "The most probable outcome after that is a fuel-fed engine fire." Malcolm straightened up. He looked at Susan. "How many hours does this aircraft have since that inspection?" he asked. 214, she said quietly. 214 hours. Probably 40-50 flights. Executives. Staff. People who got on a company jet the way most people get in a car, trusting that the machine was what it was supposed to be. Malcolm stood in that hangar for a long moment. He thought about what Delgado had called it. Deliberate. Not negligence. Not corner-cutting. Deliberate. "How many aircraft have we cleared so far?" he asked. 3, Susan said. 6 remaining. We'll finish the fleet by Wednesday. Aircraft 6 goes nowhere until the fuel system is rebuilt from scratch, he said. Not a patch, not a component replacement, the whole assembly. Agreed, Susan said. And I want to know, he said, before I leave this airfield today, which aircraft in this fleet has the highest total hours since its last deep inspection? Because that's the one that worries me most. Susan nodded. She had one of her team members pull the records. The answer came back in 8 minutes. Aircraft 9. A Bombardier Challenger. 461 hours since its last major inspection. Operated on international routes. Malcolm looked at the report. Pull Aircraft 9 out of rotation tonight, he said. Don't wait for Wednesday. Susan was already on her radio. Victoria Sterling arrived at the airfield at 5:30. She didn't come to manage the situation. She came, Malcolm would later understand, because she needed to see it. Not through a report. Not through her executives. With her own eyes. She walked through the hangar. She stopped at Aircraft 6. She listened to Susan explain the valve. She looked at the fuel system diagram. She asked 3 precise technical questions that told Malcolm she'd been doing her homework, not pretending to understand aviation, but actually trying to. When Susan finished, Victoria looked at Malcolm. How many flights did Aircraft 6 make? She said slowly, after that valve was installed. Susan checked. 41. Victoria absorbed that number. He watched her absorb it, not with guilt performance, not with the careful management of public emotion, with genuine private horror. 41 flights, she said. Nobody answered her. She looked at me. You said you were going to walk away, she said. After I refused to pay you. You said you were going to walk away and let my attorneys make it expensive for you. I did say that, he said. Why didn't you? He looked at her. I told you in my shop, he said, because it stopped being about the money. When Rachel counted 11 components in an aircraft that manifested 4, he said. That's when. Victoria looked at Aircraft 6, at the open nacelle, at the taped-off fuel system that her company had been operating for months without knowing what was inside it. Malcolm, she said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. All right. If I had paid your invoice on the first day, she said, if I had looked at it and said yes and written the check and handed it over, would you have stayed? Would you have kept looking? It was the real question, the one underneath everything. He thought about it honestly. I would have resolved the discrepancy in the primary aircraft, he said. I would have documented it, flagged it for your fleet coordinator, filed the appropriate paperwork, and waited for a response. He paused. If your fleet coordinator had responded appropriately, the investigation would have started from your side. Sooner, probably. And if they hadn't responded, then I would have done what I did anyway, he said. I would have documented everything and reported it. Because that's the job. She looked at him for a long time. But you wouldn't have caught the other aircraft, she said. I understood what she was saying. He hadn't been inside the other aircraft. He hadn't opened any nacelle except the primary jet's flight control assembly. The rest, the fleet audit, the apex vector mapping across the operation, the fuel valve, that was Susan Okafor's team. That was the independent inspection that Victoria had ordered after their conversation in his shop. No, he said honestly. I wouldn't have caught the other aircraft. That happened because you grounded the fleet. I grounded the fleet because you gave me a reason to, she said. You had reasons before I gave you one, he said. Your father had started looking at Apex Vector before he died. She went still. Delgado told me, he said. Not the detail, just that there were earlier reports. I assume your father was one of them. Victoria looked at the floor. Something moved across her face that had nothing to do with boardrooms or invoices or the operational mechanics of a private aviation program. Something that was just a daughter and a father who'd seen something coming, and the terrible distance between that warning and this hangar. "He didn't tell me what he was looking at," she said quietly. "I thought it was just his way of staying involved. He was retired. He still wanted to feel useful." She stopped. "He was trying to hand me something and I didn't know enough to take it." Malcolm said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to that. Some silences deserved to sit. After a moment, Victoria straightened up. She put her hands in her pockets. She looked at the maintenance tape across the Aircraft 6 nacelle with the focused, steady attention of someone deciding something. "I'm going to rebuild this program from the bottom up," she said. "Not cosmetically, not for the press statement. From the procurement protocols, to the inspection schedules, to who gets authority to sign what." She paused. "And I'm going to need people I can trust to help me do that." Malcolm waited. "I'm not offering you a job," she said. "I already know what you'd say." The smallest pause, almost humor in it. "I'm asking whether Hayes Aeroworks would be willing to help design the new standards." He looked at her. "What does that mean practically?" he said. "It means I want you and your team to help us build an inspection protocol that doesn't have the holes this one had," she said. "An independent protocol, maintained independently, that reports to the board rather than to operations." She paused. "So that the next time someone inside this company decides that procurement shortcuts are acceptable, there is a system in place that will find it." He thought about it. "Who authorizes the final say on airworthiness?" he said. "The independent inspector," she said. "You or whoever Hayes Aeroworks designates." "No executive override." "No executive override," she said. "Board reporting only," he said. "In writing. Every flag, every discrepancy, every unresolved item. The board sees it before operations does." "Agreed," she said. He thought about Rachel's call that afternoon. 3 new inquiry calls. Companies asking if Hayes Aeroworks did fleet audits. I thought about what a fleet audit program run independently with a federal investigation as proof of methodology would actually mean for his operation. He thought about Jerome, 22 years old, asking intelligent questions about tolerances and material fatigue. He thought about the hangar with his name on the door. "I'll need to bring in more people," he said. "I know," she said. "It'll cost you more than the restoration did." "I know that too," she said. "I own 11 aircraft, and I just found out I can't trust my own maintenance program. Cheap is not what I'm buying." He nodded once. "I'll have Rachel put together a scope proposal by Friday," he said. Victoria extended her hand. He shook it. It was a different handshake than the first one, the one in the conference room that hadn't happened because she hadn't offered it. This one had weight to it, not the weight of money, the weight of what it had cost both of them to arrive at this moment. Malcolm looked at Aircraft 6 one more time before he left the hangar. The fuel valve that had flown 41 flights upside down. The nacelle taped shut. The system that would need to be rebuilt from scratch. He thought about 41 flights. About the people on those flights who had no way of knowing that the machine carrying them across the sky had been quietly, deliberately compromised. He thought about his daughter. About the question she'd asked him on the phone in that steady, too-adult voice. "Was the plane safe when you fixed it?" He'd answered no. "That's why I walked away." He'd been right about the primary aircraft. I hadn't known yet about Aircraft 6. He hadn't known yet about Aircraft 9. He hadn't known the full shape of what he'd stepped into the middle of. But he'd walked away anyway. Because the job wasn't to make the flight happen. The job was to make sure it came back. He picked up his tools and walked to his truck in the early evening air. Behind him, the hangar lights were still on, and Susan Okafor's team was still working, and somewhere inside a federal building downtown, a warrant was being executed, and a name was being processed, and the thread Malcolm Hayes had found inside a $48 million jet was being pulled carefully and methodically toward everything it was attached to. He drove home. Maya was at the kitchen table again. He sat across from her. She looked up over her homework glasses. "How was work?" she asked. "I thought about the fuel valve. About 41 flights. About Victoria Sterling's face in the hangar." Important, he said. She looked at him for a moment. She had her mother's eyes, precise and quiet, and capable of reading things that hadn't been said yet. Good important or hard important? She asked. He thought about it. Both, he said. Same thing usually. She nodded as though that was exactly the answer she expected, and went back to her homework. He sat there for a while in the kitchen light. And for the first time since the morning he'd walked into Victoria Sterling's conference room with a 6-pound binder and an invoice. Nobody laughed at twice. Malcolm Hayes let himself feel the full weight of what he'd been holding. And then he put it down. The warrant was executed at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after Malcolm shook Victoria Sterling's hand in the hangar. He found out from Rachel, who found out from a contact at the Dallas field office, who sent a 2-word text that said simply, "It happened." Rachel forwarded it to Malcolm without comment, and he read it standing at his workbench with a torque wrench in his hand and a feeling in his chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite satisfaction. It was something older and quieter than either of those things. The feeling of a door closing on something that needed to be closed. The name that came with the warrant, the name Delgado had mentioned but couldn't share, was a man named Curtis Hayward. 51 years old. Sterling Crown's Director of Aviation Procurement for the past 7 years. 17 years in the private aviation industry before that. Moving through procurement roles at 3 different corporate flight departments, leaving each one under circumstances that in retrospect had visible fingerprints all over them. Malcolm didn't know any of that on Tuesday morning. He learned it in pieces over the following days, the way you learn the shape of something that's been operating in the dark, not all at once, but in accumulating detail, each piece, making the previous one make more sense. What he knew on Tuesday morning was that the man who had been systematically installing compromised components into aircraft that carried human beings was no longer making decisions about which components went into aircraft. And that the documentation that had produced the warrant, 312 pages, 4 copies organized and indexed and sourced, had originated in a shop with his name on the door. He put down the torque wrench and called Rachel. "Fleet inspection status?" he asked. "Susan's team finished aircraft 9 yesterday evening," Rachel said. "Clean on the Apex Vector components, but they found a hydraulic line installation that doesn't meet spec. Nothing catastrophic, but it's been logged and flagged. Aircraft 10 and 11. 10 is clean. 11 they're starting today." She paused. "Malcolm." The charter company called back. The one that left the inquiry message last week. "What did they say?" "They said they heard about the fuel valve on aircraft 6, Rachel said. "News travels fast in this industry, apparently." "What did they want?" "They want Hayes Aeroworks to conduct a full fleet audit on their operation," Rachel said. 6 aircraft. They want it done before the end of the month because they have a contract renewal with their primary corporate client, and they want independent certification before the renewal meeting. Malcolm was quiet for a moment. "How many aircraft did you say?" 6. "What's their fleet?" "Mix of Citations and 1 Gulfstream," Rachel said. "Based out of Love Field." He thought about capacity. About Jerome, who was good and getting better. About David Torres, who'd offered to come up from Austin. About the 3 empty workbench spaces where equipment used to be before the lean weeks, now refilled with new orders he'd placed the day the Sterling Crown wire cleared. "Call them back," he said. "Tell them I'll meet with them Thursday." "I already have 2 other meetings Thursday," Rachel said. "Move one," he said. She sighed, not unhappily. "I'm going to need help with scheduling." "Hire someone," he said. A pause. A longer one than he expected. "Malcolm," Rachel said. "Did you just tell me to hire someone?" "An office coordinator," he said. "Someone who can manage scheduling and client communication. Post the position today." Another pause. "You know what this means." "It means we're growing," he said. "Post it today, Rachel." He hung up. He stood in the shop for a moment looking at the workbenches. At the name above the door, visible from inside through the window. Hayes Aeroworks. Still his. Still standing. And now, for the first time in a long time, actually moving forward instead of just holding on. His phone buzzed. Daniel Mercer. He answered. Good morning, Captain. Good morning. Daniel's voice was steady, unhurried as always. I assume you've heard. 2 words from Rachel's contact, Malcolm said. Curtis Hayward. I've known that name for 6 hours, Daniel said. I'm still processing it. Did you know him? I knew of him, Daniel said. Never worked with him directly. He handled procurement. I handled operations. Different worlds in a corporate flight department. He paused. But I knew something was wrong in that department, for a couple of years. Malcolm went still. You knew. Not what I know now, Daniel said immediately. Not specifically, but there were anomalies. Components that didn't match my memory of what we'd ordered. Invoices that came through after maintenance events, not before. Small things. The kind of thing that makes you pause and then move on because nothing visible is failing and you don't have the technical evidence to take it further. His voice was heavier than usual. I should have pushed harder. You refused to fly the aircraft, Malcolm said. When the log was wrong, you refused. That matters. That was 1 aircraft on 1 morning, Daniel said. Curtis Hayward was running this for 4 years. Then the question is, what we do with what we know now, Malcolm said. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about that, he said. I've been thinking about it since Monday night. Another pause. I'm going to retire at the end of this year. I had already made that decision before any of this happened, but I've been thinking about what I want to do with what's left. And I want to help you, Daniel said. Not as a pilot, as someone who has been inside corporate aviation operations for 30 years and knows where the vulnerabilities are. He paused. When you build the new standards for Sterling Crown, when you build the protocol, Victoria asked you to design. I want to help you think through the operational side, the gaps that someone like Curtis Hayward knows how to find. Malcolm thought about that. About 31 years of flight operations, every aircraft, every facility, the accumulated knowledge of a man who had been watching how this industry worked for longer than some of his team members had been alive. You'd be a consultant, Malcolm said, not an employee. That suits me, Daniel said. Flat rate per engagement, Malcolm said. I don't do retainers. Neither do I, Daniel said. Then we have a deal, Malcolm said. He hung up. And for a moment, he just stood in the shop, feeling the shape of something that was rearranging itself. Hayes Aeroworks had spent 6 weeks on the edge of losing everything. Now, 11 days later, it was adding a scheduling coordinator, talking to a charter company about a 6-aircraft audit, and potentially bringing in one of the most experienced corporate aviation pilots in Texas as a consulting partner. All because a woman laughed at an invoice. I thought about that. He would think about it in different ways for the rest of his career. At 9:15 that morning, Victoria's general counsel called. His name was Thomas Reardon, and his voice had the careful, measured quality of someone who had spent 30 years saying difficult things to powerful people without losing his job. Mr. Hayes, he said, I want to brief you on what you should expect in the coming weeks given your role in the documentation that produced yesterday's warrant. I'm listening, Malcolm said. The federal investigation will require a deposition from you and from Ms. Kim, Reardon said. We expect that to happen within the next 2 to 3 weeks. You should retain your own counsel for that process. Sterling Crown will not be providing legal representation for witnesses in the federal investigation, as the company is itself a subject of the inquiry. I understand that, Malcolm said. Additionally, Reardon said, and his voice shifted slightly, not warmer exactly, but more careful, like he was stepping around something fragile. There will be civil exposure. Apex Vector's principals will almost certainly pursue third-party claims as part of their defense. Suppliers in these situations frequently attempt to shift liability by implicating contractors and inspectors who interacted with the components. Malcolm felt something settle in his gut. Not fear, just the recognition of a thing he'd known was coming. They're going to say I should have flagged it earlier, he said. They're going to say whatever creates doubt, Reardon said. That is the nature of this kind of defense. I want you to understand it before it happens, so that when it happens, you are not caught off guard. Mr. Reardon, Malcolm said, I have 312 pages of documentation showing exactly when I found the component, exactly what I did with the information, Exactly who I notified and when. He paused. Let them say what they want. A brief silence. Yes, Reardon said. That is precisely the correct answer. He paused again. For what it's worth. Mr. Hayes and I realize this comes from the company's attorney, so weight it accordingly. I have been in corporate law for 27 years. I have reviewed a great deal of contractor documentation in the context of safety incidents. Yours is among the most thorough I have encountered. Malcolm said thank you and hung up. I didn't feel proud. He felt like a man who had done his job correctly and was now dealing with the consequences of the world not being structured to make that easy. I thought about retaining counsel. He thought about his bank account better than it had been 2 weeks ago, not as comfortable as it was going to need to be. He called a lawyer he knew in Fort Worth, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had handled 2 previous contract disputes for Hayes Aeroworks, and who had the particular quality Malcolm valued most in attorneys. She told you exactly what the situation was, without making it sound worse than it was or better than it was. She picked up on the third ring. He explained the situation in 8 minutes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Federal deposition potential civil third-party claim. Aviation safety documentation as primary evidence. Yes, he said. I need to read your documentation package before I can tell you anything useful, she said. Send it today. You'll have it within the hour, he said. He was about to hang up when she said, Malcolm, one question. Go ahead. Is there anything in that documentation that you're uncertain about? Any entry, any timestamp, any sourced record that you can't fully stand behind? He thought about it. He thought about every page, every tab, every cross-reference Rachel had pulled and verified, every entry he'd made in real time, not reconstructed, not edited, not interpreted after the fact. No, he said. Good, she said. That's the only thing that matters. Send the package. He sent it. The morning moved, the way. Mornings moved when the work was real, not dramatically, but with a kind of purposeful momentum that felt like the shop had found its rhythm again. Jerome arrived at 8 and immediately started on a pre-scheduled inspection for a different client. A small aircraft operator out of Addison Airport who needed annual maintenance work done and wasn't connected to the Sterling Crown situation in any way. That job mattered to Malcolm, maybe more than it should have, because it was evidence that Hayes Aeroworks was not just a Sterling Crown satellite. It was its own thing doing its own work on its own terms. He spent 2 hours at his desk reviewing the scope proposal Rachel had drafted for the Sterling Crown Safety Protocol contract. It was thorough the way everything Rachel did was thorough. She'd built in independent reporting structures, board-level notification requirements, escalation procedures that didn't pass through operations management, and a compensation structure that reflected the actual cost of doing the work correctly rather than the minimum necessary to get the signature. HIMOD 3 changes. Then he sent it to Victoria with a note that said, Proposal attached. The non-negotiables are on page 4. She replied in 11 minutes. Not to the proposal. Just 2 words agreed. Proceed. He stared at that for a moment. 2 words. From a woman who had once occupied an entire conference room with attorneys and executives and a pre-positioned decision to pay him $45,000 and close the door. He filed her reply in the contract folder and moved on. That afternoon at 2:22, everything changed again. Susan Okafor called him from the airfield. She didn't start with context. She didn't build toward it. She said, Aircraft 11, we opened the avionics bay. And, Malcolm said. Malcolm. She paused. I need you here. He was in his truck in 4 minutes. He arrived at the airfield at 2:51. Susan met him at the hangar door. Show me, he said. She showed him. The avionics bay on Aircraft 11, a Bombardier Learjet that Sterling Crown used primarily for short-haul executive routes, had been opened for the standard audit inspection. Inside the bay, behind the main avionics stack, Susan's team had found a secondary GPS receiver that was not in the aircraft's maintenance log. Not a manufacturer-installed unit. An aftermarket device mounted with hardware that didn't match the aircraft's documentation wired into the navigation system through a junction that had been accessed and resealed with sealant that didn't match the manufacturer-specified compound. Malcolm looked at it for a long time. "It's a tracker," he said. "That's what our avionics lead thinks," Susan said. "Not a navigation aid, a position tracker. Transmitting. We're not sure yet. We haven't powered it up. We're waiting for the FAA's technical team." Malcolm looked at the wiring. At the junction. At the sealant that somebody had applied in a hurry, or without the right materials, or both. He thought about what kind of person installed an unauthorized tracking device in a private corporate aircraft and what they would want with the positional data of a CEO's flight schedule. "This wasn't Apex Vector," he said. "No," Susan said. "This is something different." "How long has this aircraft been in service?" "Since the last major inspection. 14 months. 14 months of position data. Every flight this aircraft took. Every route. Every destination, every arrival and departure time, transmitted to wherever the receiver was sending it." "Who else has had access to this aircraft?" Malcolm said. "We've pulled the access logs," Susan said. "The hangar records show routine access for pre-flight and post-flight. Nothing unusual." She paused. "Except for one entry 7 months ago, a maintenance visit logged under Curtis Hayward's authorization code." The name landed like a stone. Curtis Hayward, already in federal custody for the Apex Vector procurement fraud. And now his authorization code on the access log for an aircraft with an unauthorized tracking device inside it. Malcolm straightened up. "Delgado," he said. "I've already called him," Susan said. "His team is 20 minutes out." Malcolm stood in the hangar and let the geometry of it settle. Curtis Hayward hadn't just been selling out Sterling Crown's maintenance program to a supplier with junk certification history. He'd been transmitting Sterling Crown's flight schedule, Victoria Sterling's flight schedule, to someone who wanted to know where she was when she'd be where, how to predict her movements. "Do you know which routes this aircraft runs?" Malcolm asked. "Primarily Dallas to New York," Susan said. "Sometimes Chicago. Occasionally to the Gulf Coast properties. Dallas to New York. The flight Victoria had been trying to take the morning the pilots refused. The flight she'd needed so badly, she'd offered bonuses to 7 different pilots. The flight that had been scheduled publicly enough that anyone monitoring a tracking device inside the aircraft would have known exactly when it was supposed to leave and exactly where it was supposed to land. Malcolm thought about that morning. About Daniel Mercer coming down the air stairs with his flight bag. About 6 pilots saying no. About the aircraft sitting grounded on the tarmac. He thought about what might have happened if the maintenance log had been clean. If his name had been in the certificate. If Daniel had flown. He thought about it for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he put it away because there was work to do, and thinking about what might have happened was less useful than making sure it didn't happen again. Delgado arrived at 3:22 with 2 additional agents and a technical specialist in a separate vehicle. They moved through the hangar with the contained urgency of people who had just had the scope of their investigation expand in a direction they'd half expected. Delgado looked at the tracking device for 2 minutes without speaking. Then he looked at Malcolm. "When you were conducting the restoration on the primary aircraft," he said, "did you access the avionics bay?" "Standard restoration scope doesn't include avionics unless there's a flagged issue," Malcolm said. "We didn't access it on the primary aircraft. So if there's a device in the primary aircraft's avionics bay, you need to open it," Malcolm said. Delgado turned to his technical specialist. The specialist was already moving. They opened the avionics bay on the primary aircraft, the $48 million Bombardier Global 7500, at 3:44. Inside, behind the main stack in a location nearly identical to where the device had been found in Aircraft 11, there was nothing. The bay was clean. Malcolm stared at it. "Why is this one clean?" he said, more to himself than to anyone else. The technical specialist said, "Because this aircraft has been in restoration for 6 weeks. Anyone monitoring the fleet would know it wasn't flying." She looked at the bay. No reason to track an aircraft that's grounded for maintenance. Malcolm thought about that, about the logic of it, about someone who was careful enough to think through which aircraft were worth tracking and which weren't. Then he thought about something else. The restoration. he said slowly. I was inside this aircraft for 6 weeks. My team was inside it. Delgado looked at him. If someone was monitoring who had access to Sterling Crown's aircraft. Malcolm stopped. They would know you were here, Delgado said. For 6 weeks, Malcolm said. And they would know I was doing a deep restoration. Which means they would know that if anything was hidden in this aircraft, Malcolm said, I was in the best possible position to find it. The hangar went quiet. Delgado looked at his agents. Something passed between them, a communication that didn't require words. Mr. Hayes, Delgado said, has anything unusual happened to you or your team in the past 6 weeks? Any contact you didn't initiate? Any visits to your shop by people you didn't know? Any communication that felt off? Malcolm thought about it carefully. He went back through the 6 weeks of the restoration. The late nights. The supplier delays. The component hunts. The cot in the hangar. Then he thought about something he'd filed away at the time as irrelevant. Week 3 of the restoration, he said. I came back from a supply run, and the hangar had been accessed in my absence. I checked the access log, and there was an entry I didn't recognize. I assumed it was Sterling Crown's facilities team doing a routine check. I noted it in my personal log and moved on. Do you still have that access record? Delgado said. In my daily log, Malcolm said. Yes. I need it today, Delgado said. I'll text it to you within the hour, Malcolm said. Delgado turned to his agents again, then back to Malcolm. Mr. Hayes, I need to ask you something directly. Ask it, Malcolm said. Is there any possibility, any at all, that someone tried to access the primary aircraft systems while your team was conducting the restoration and you didn't notice because of the volume of work? Malcolm held the investigator's gaze. I thought about every night in that hangar. About the maintenance log updated in real time. About the documentation discipline that Rachel had described as obsessive, which was the most accurate word for it. About the fact that he cross-referenced every component, every wire run, every system access against the aircraft's documentation history. If someone had accessed the primary aircraft systems during my restoration, Malcolm said, they would have had to do it while I was in the hangar, because I was in the hangar almost continuously for 6 weeks. They would have had to do it without disturbing any of my ongoing work. And their access would have shown up in the maintenance log, which I reviewed every morning against the previous day's entries. He paused. So yes, he said, it's possible. But if they did it, they were very, very good. And they would have left traces. Your technical team should look. Delgado nodded. His technical specialist was already back inside the primary aircraft. Malcolm walked outside the hangar and called Rachel. He explained what they'd found in Aircraft 11. She was silent for a long moment. A tracker, she said. A position tracker, he said. 14 months of flight data. Malcolm. Her voice was careful. The unauthorized hangar access, week 3. I already told Delgado, he said. No, she said. I mean, I pulled something when I was building the documentation package. I didn't think it was relevant, so I didn't include it. A pause. 2 weeks before you started the restoration, there was an inquiry about Hayes Aeroworks from a corporate email address I didn't recognize. They asked about our availability and our rates for a restoration class project. I responded with our standard information sheet. They never followed up. What was the email address? Malcolm said. That's the thing, Rachel said. I tried to trace it last month when I was doing a general inbox review. The domain doesn't exist anymore. It was registered 2 weeks before the inquiry and abandoned about a week after. Malcolm stood outside the hangar in the afternoon air. He thought about what that meant. About someone who was careful enough to use a temporary email domain. About the timing 2 weeks before the Sterling Crown restoration contract landed on his desk. Someone was checking us out, he said, before we got the contract. Before Sterling Crown even called us, Rachel said. Because Sterling Crown called you 3 weeks after that email came in. Which means... He stopped. He worked through it. Which means someone knew Sterling Crown was going to need a restoration contractor, Rachel said, before Sterling Crown's procurement department had made the decision. She paused. Because someone inside procurement was making it. Curtis Hayward had been director of aviation procurement. Curtis Hayward, who had systematically compromised Sterling Crown's maintenance program for 4 years. Curtis Hayward, whose authorization code appeared in the access log for aircraft 11 7 months ago. Malcolm thought about it in one long connected line, the way he traced a wiring fault, not jumping to conclusions, but following the circuit component by component until the break became visible. Curtis Hayward had arranged for Malcolm to get the restoration contract. Not because Malcolm was the best option, because he was the option that would be inside that aircraft, doing a deep restoration for 6 weeks, long enough to be in a position to find the things Hayward needed found. But that didn't track. If Hayward was hiding components inside the aircraft, he wouldn't want a meticulous restorer finding them. Unless Malcolm's mind went somewhere cold and specific, unless the components weren't what Hayward was hiding, unless the tracking device was. "Rachel," he said. "The primary aircraft, the Global 7500, it wasn't tracked." "The bay was clean," she said. "You said." "It was clean when they opened it today," he said. "But what if it wasn't clean before I started the restoration?" Silence on the line. "What if someone installed a tracking device on the primary aircraft?" he said slowly, "and then the restoration started? And what if whoever was monitoring that device knew the restoration was going to uncover it? And what if they needed someone to get inside that aircraft and make the aircraft and everyone around it look like the focus of a legitimate maintenance dispute, while the real problem was being quietly removed?" He could hear Rachel breathing on the other end of the line. "You're saying someone used you," she said. "Someone used the restoration," he said. "Used the invoice dispute, the safety flag, the whole situation, as a distraction." From what? He thought about the 14 months of flight data in Aircraft 11. About Victoria Sterling's routes. About someone wanting to know where she was when. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I think Delgado needs to know what you just told me. About that email. Today." "I'll pull the records right now," Rachel said. He went back inside. He found Delgado and said, "I need to tell you something." He told him about the email, about the timing, about the theory that was forming. Delgado listened without interrupting. His face was absolutely still. When Malcolm finished, Delgado was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "in 23 years with the FAA, I have had contractors come me with documentation, with reports, with verbal testimony." He paused. "I have never had a contractor come to me with a theory that was both credible and structurally sound within 90 seconds of hearing new information." Malcolm looked at him. "How did you develop that connection so fast?" Delgado asked. "That's how I trace electrical faults," Malcolm said. "You don't assume, you follow the circuit." Delgado pulled out his phone. He made a call. He said 2 sentences to whoever answered and then hung up. Then he looked at Malcolm. "We're going to need you to sit down with the full investigation team tomorrow morning," he said. 7 a.m., our Dallas field office." "I'll be there," Malcolm said. "Bring Ms. Kim." "I'll bring Ms. Kim," Malcolm said. Delgado paused. "Malcolm, the theory you just laid out, if it holds up, this is no longer just a procurement fraud case. Do you understand that?" Malcolm looked at him. He thought about Victoria Sterling. About a woman who'd inherited a company and a father's unfinished investigation and hadn't known enough yet to understand what she was holding. About 14 months of flight data. About someone wanting to know where she was. "I understand it," he said, "and you're still prepared to cooperate fully." "Mr. Delgado," Malcolm said, "I've been cooperating fully since the moment I picked up the phone and called my avionics specialist instead of signing a certificate I wasn't certain about." He paused. "That's not heroism. That's the job. I'm not going to stop doing it because it got bigger than I expected." Delgado looked at him for a moment. Then he did something Malcolm hadn't seen him do since they'd met. He extended his hand. Malcolm shook it. He drove to Victoria Sterling's office at 5:45. He didn't call ahead. He walked in, told the receptionist he needed 5 minutes with Ms. Sterling, and waited. She came down herself. Not her assistant. Not a deputy. Her. They stood in the lobby of Sterling Crown Industries, and Malcolm told her in 4 sentences what Delgado's team had found. The tracking device. The access log. The email that predated the contract. The theory. Victoria Sterling stood very still. She was good at still. He'd noticed that before. But this was different from the conference room kind of still. This was the still of someone whose body was processing something the mind wasn't ready to accept yet. Someone was tracking my flights, she said. For 14 months, he said. And you think Curtis Hayward? I think Curtis Hayward was part of something larger than a procurement fraud, Malcolm said. I think Delgado's team is going to be working that thread for a while. He paused. I wanted you to know before you heard it from somewhere else. She looked at him. Why? She said. Because you grounded your fleet when you didn't have to, he said. Because you called the FAA before you called your lawyers. Because you came to my shop alone. He paused. And because your father wrote your name in a notebook too. Just not on the same list as mine. She blinked. Just once. What list was my name on? She said. He didn't give it a title, Malcolm said. It was just a list of people he was worried about, people he wanted to make sure were protected. He paused. Daniel told me. He read the notebooks after Charles died. Victoria was quiet for a very long moment. Then she said quietly, almost to herself, He knew. He knew something, Malcolm said. He didn't know how much. She looked at the floor, then back at Malcolm. What do I do? She said, and it was the most human thing he'd heard her say. Not the CEO, not the billion-dollar heir, just a woman standing in the lobby of her company asking a mechanic what to do. Go home, he said. Let Delgado's team do their work tonight. Cooperate completely tomorrow, and trust that you made the right calls when it mattered. She nodded. Malcolm, she said as he turned to leave. He stopped. Thank you, she said. Not for the work, for the conversation in your shop, for making me understand what I was actually looking at. He looked at her. That's what your father paid me for, he said. The first time. He walked out. He got in his truck. He sat there for a moment in the Sterling Crown parking garage. He thought about circuits, about how a fault doesn't announce itself. It hides in the system drawing power, creating heat until something is stressed enough to fail. And the only way to find it is to trace every line, follow every connection, refuse to assume that clean means safe. He thought about 19 years of doing exactly that. He pulled out of the garage and drove toward home. His phone rang at 6:17. Patricia Osei, his lawyer. I read the documentation package, she said. And if anyone comes at you in a civil claim, she said, they're going to wish they hadn't. A pause. Malcolm, this documentation is a fortress. Every date, every source, every notification. There is no gap in this record that anyone can drive a theory through. She paused again. How long have you been documenting like this? 19 years, he said. Every job. Every job. She was quiet for a moment. That's why nobody can touch you, she said. That's why nobody gets hurt, he said. The documentation is the job, not a protection strategy, the job. She said she'd handle the deposition prep and call him in the morning. He drove home. Maya was at the kitchen table. She looked up when he walked in. She looked at his face for 2 seconds, the way she always looked at his face when he came home late, reading the day off him, the way her mother used to. Big day, she said. Big week, he said. She pushed her homework aside. Dad, I looked you up today. He raised an eyebrow. Looked me up. On my school's laptop, she said. During free period. She paused. There's an article about the Sterling Crown grounding. It doesn't say your name, but it says an independent mechanic's safety documentation led to the federal investigation. She looked at him. That's you. He sat down. Yeah, he said. That's me. She looked at him steadily. How do you feel? She asked. He thought about it. About the tracking device. About Aircraft 11. About 41 flights with an upside-down valve. About the circuit he'd followed from a conference table and a laughed-at invoice to a federal field office and a warrant. Like I did my job, he said. She nodded, like that was exactly the right answer. Good, she said. She went back to her homework. He sat across from her and thought about tomorrow. About 7 a.m. at the federal field office. About the investigation that was bigger than anyone had understood on the morning Victoria Sterling laughed at his invoice. He thought about the circuit, about following every line, about refusing to assume that clean meant safe, about the things that hide in systems drawing power, creating heat, waiting for the stress that makes them fail. He thought about the men on every aircraft in Sterling Crown's fleet who had boarded thinking the machine beneath them was exactly what it was supposed to be. He thought about the fact that right now tonight, because a woman had refused to pay an invoice and a mechanic had refused to sign a certificate, every one of those aircraft was on the ground. He looked at his daughter. He thought about his wife. I thought about 19 years and 312 pages and a key placed on a conference table without a word. He thought about the job. And the job wasn't done. The federal field office in downtown Dallas occupied the 14th floor of a building that smelled like recycled air and institutional coffee. Malcolm arrived at 6:53, 7 minutes before Delgado had asked for, because being on time meant being early, and being early meant being prepared. Rachel was already in the lobby when he walked in, her tablet under her arm, and a look on her face that said she hadn't slept much, but had spent the hours she was awake doing something useful. They called me at 5:30, she said quietly as he came through the door. Why? They want the original email records, the domain registration trace, everything I have on the inquiry that came in before the contract. Did you bring it? She held up the tablet. All of it, exported, time-stamped, and organized. He nodded once. That was Rachel. That was always Rachel. They went up together. Delgado met them in a conference room that had too many chairs and not enough windows. With him was a woman named Agent Sandra Cho from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, not FAA FBI, which told Malcolm that the scope of what they'd found in Aircraft 11 had expanded overnight the way he'd expected it to, and two technical analysts who had apparently been working since 4 in the morning based on the coffee cups and the particular hollow-eyed focus of people running on caffeine and urgency. Delgado introduced everyone with the economy of a man who didn't waste words in rooms where time was the resource. We pulled the email domain records last night, he said, looking at Rachel. The registration traces to a shell company with addresses in 3 states, none of which correspond to a physical location. But the payment trail for the domain registration goes through a financial account that we've seen before in a different context. Rachel set her tablet on the table. Same account. Same network, Delgado said. Different account, same network, which is how these things work. He looked at Malcolm. Your theory from yesterday afternoon, about the restoration being used as cover. Our technical team spent the night running it against the timeline. And, Malcolm said, Agent Cho spoke for the first time. She had the clipped precision of someone who thought in sequences rather than narratives. 18 months ago, Sterling Crown's avionics contractor performed routine maintenance on Aircraft 11. The maintenance log for that visit is clean. The work was performed correctly, documented correctly, signed off correctly. She paused. However, the maintenance window for that visit was 4 hours. The job log shows it was completed in 2 hours and 40 minutes, leaving an hour and 20 minutes unaccounted for, Malcolm said, during which the avionics bay was accessible, Cho said, and during which, based on the access card data we pulled last night, 2 people entered and exited the hangar. One was the avionics contractor. One was a second individual using an access code registered to a Sterling Crown Facilities account that was supposedly inactive. Curtis Hayward's account, Malcolm said. Not Hayward's personal account, Cho said. An account that Hayward administered. There's a difference. It means either Hayward installed the device himself or authorized someone else to do it using an access credential only he controlled. Malcolm absorbed that. Who installed it? Rachel said. We don't know yet, Cho said. That's what this morning is about. She looked at her files. What we know is that the tracking device in Aircraft 11 was transmitting flight position data to a receiver registered to another shell company. The shell company received data from 3 different aircraft over an 18-month period. 3 aircraft, Malcolm said. Not just 11. 3, Cho confirmed. We identified the other 2 last night using the transmission signatures. One is a fractional ownership aircraft that Victoria Sterling uses occasionally for personal travel. One is a mid-sized charter aircraft operated by a company called Meridian Executive Transport. Malcolm went still. Meridian. That was the name of the inspection firm. Susan Okafor's firm. The one Victoria had hired to conduct the fleet audit. He looked at Delgado. Meridian Aero and Meridian Executive Transport, he said carefully. Are those the same company? Different companies, Delgado said. Same name, different operations. We checked at 3 this morning. Meridian Aero is a legitimate inspection firm with no connection to the transport company. Malcolm exhaled. But the charter aircraft being tracked, he said. The Meridian Executive Transport aircraft. Where does that connection go? Cho looked at her notes. Meridian Executive Transport has one primary corporate client, she said. A private equity firm based in Houston. The firm has made 3 attempts in the past 24 months to acquire a controlling interest in Sterling Crown Industries. The room was very quiet. Malcolm looked at Delgado. Someone was trying to acquire Victoria's company, he said. Someone was building a picture of Victoria Sterling's movements, her schedule, her patterns, Delgado said. Combined with the Apex Vector procurement fraud, which was generating significant internal compliance liability for Sterling Crown, a hostile acquirer would have a strong position. A company with documented safety violations, a grounded fleet and federal scrutiny is worth considerably less than the same company operating cleanly. They were manufacturing the conditions for a forced sale, Malcolm said. That is our current working theory, Delgado said. We are not there yet on evidence, but we are building toward it. Rachel had her stylus moving on her tablet making notes. She stopped. She looked up. The email inquiry to Hayes Aero Works, she said. 2 weeks before Sterling Crown called Malcolm. If someone inside procurement knew the restoration contract was coming and knew which contractor would get it, they would know exactly who was going to be inside that aircraft, Delgado said, for 6 weeks. Long enough to know whether the device in the primary aircraft needed to be moved, Malcolm said. Long enough to access the hangar and remove it if necessary. Which may be why the primary aircraft's avionics bay was clean, Cho said. Not because no device was ever there, because someone removed it when the restoration started and the risk of discovery increased. Malcolm thought about week 3 of the restoration. The hangar access he'd logged and set aside. The entry he'd assumed was Sterling Crown's facilities team. Someone had come into his hangar while he was on a supply run. Not to install something, to remove something. Using him, his reputation, his thoroughness, his documentation, discipline, as the reason to cover their tracks. He felt something he didn't feel often. Not anger. Something colder than anger. The recognition of having been used precisely because of who he was. Because someone had understood his methodology well enough to know that if Malcolm Hayes was doing a deep restoration, anything hidden in that aircraft was going to be found. And so the smarter move was to use his presence as cover for the removal. They had counted on his thoroughness to protect their operation. I thought about that for a long moment. Then he thought about the fact that it hadn't worked. Because Rachel had logged the email. Because he had logged the hangar access. Because 312 pages of documentation had given Delgado's team a timeline specific enough to see the gap where something should have been and wasn't. You can try to use a meticulous man's habits against him, but his habits also record everything you did. What do you need from me this morning? Malcolm said. The deposition prep took 3 hours. It was thorough, specific, and at certain points genuinely difficult. Not because the facts were uncertain, but because translating 19 years of technical instinct into language a federal case could use required the kind of patience that Malcolm usually reserved for particularly complex wire runs. He was precise. He was consistent. He went back and corrected himself twice when he realized he'd used shorthand that assumed knowledge the legal record couldn't assume. And each time Cho nodded with the approval of someone who understood that a witness who self-corrects is a witness the other side can't easily shake. Rachel's deposition was even cleaner than his. She had timestamps for everything. At 11, they broke. Delgado walked them to the elevator. "One more thing," he said. "The name of the private equity firm in Houston. I can't share it officially. But the principals of that firm are known to us from a prior investigation unrelated to aviation. If you hear the name Crestline Capital in the next few weeks, pay attention." He hit the elevator button and walked back down the hall without another word. Malcolm and Rachel rode down in silence. In the lobby, Rachel said, "Crestline Capital." "I heard it," he said. "I'm going to look them up," she said. "Don't," he said. "Not yet. Let Delgado's team do their work. We documented what we found. Our job isn't the investigation." She looked at him. "What is our job?" He held the lobby door open. "Making sure the aircraft fly safe," he said. "Same as always." They walked out into the Dallas midday. The work that followed was not glamorous. It was the kind of work that real things are built from, methodical, unglamorous day after day. Progress that doesn't announce itself. The Sterling Crown Fleet inspection wrapped up on Wednesday. Aircraft 11 was grounded indefinitely pending the federal investigation. Aircraft 6 had its fuel system rebuilt from scratch by Malcolm's team over 4 days, with Jerome taking the lead on the bracket reinstallation under Malcolm's supervision, and Jerome doing it correctly on the first try, with the careful, focused energy of a young man who understood that there were no second tries at this altitude. Aircraft 9's hydraulic line was replaced and certified by Meridian Aero. The remaining aircraft came back into service one by one, as Susan Okafor's team cleared them, with Malcolm signing off on each airworthiness certificate, with the same deliberate attention. He gave every signature, not slowly, not ceremonially, but with the weight of someone who understood what the name meant. Daniel Mercer called on Thursday afternoon. "Aircraft 4 cleared this morning," he said. "I flew it to New York." "How did it feel?" Malcolm said. "Like an aircraft that's been properly inspected," Daniel said. "Which is to say, it felt exactly like it was supposed to feel, and I didn't think about it once after Wheels Up." He paused. "That's the point, isn't it? When the work is done right, you stop thinking about it. The aircraft disappears and you just fly." "That's the point," Malcolm agreed. 3 weeks after the warrant, Curtis Hayward was formally indicted on 11 counts, including procurement fraud, falsification of federal aviation safety records, and conspiracy to defraud. The indictment named 2 additional individuals, both connected to Crestline Capital's operational network, on related charges involving unauthorized tracking and corporate espionage. The Houston firm issued a statement denying involvement. Nobody in private aviation paid much attention to the statement. Victoria Sterling held a press conference on a Tuesday morning and said things that CEOs rarely say at press conferences. She said her company had failed. She said the failure had been systemic, had persisted for years, and had gone undetected because she had not paid sufficient attention to the operational details of a program that was literally responsible for keeping people alive. She said the independent mechanic whose safety flag had initiated the discovery of the fraud had exercised more professional integrity under financial pressure than her entire executive team had exercised with every resource available to them. She did not say Malcolm's name. He had asked her not to, and she had respected it. But Daniel Mercer, who watched the press conference from his kitchen, called Malcolm immediately afterward. "She said it," Daniel said. "I know," Malcolm said. He'd watched it on his phone from his workbench. "She meant it," Daniel said. "I know that too," Malcolm said. "How do you know?" "Because she could have done a version of that press conference that sounded like accountability without actually being it," Malcolm said. "I've seen those. She didn't do that version." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "She didn't." The proposal. Malcolm had sent Victoria the one with the non-negotiables on page 4, was formalized into a contract in the 4th week. Hayes Aeroworks as independent aviation safety inspector for Sterling Crown's fleet, reporting directly to the board with full authority over airworthiness certification and zero executive override capacity. The compensation was structured the way Malcolm had insisted: flat rate per inspection, no retainer, no corporate relationship that could create the illusion of dependency. He signed it in his shop at his desk with Rachel watching. When he put the pen down, Rachel said, "You know what this means for the business." "It means we need 2 more qualified inspectors," he said. At minimum, she said. Post the positions today, he said. I posted them yesterday, she said. I already have 6 applications. He looked at her. I know how you think, she said simply. Jerome heard about the positions from the break room and appeared in Malcolm's office doorway at 4:15 that afternoon with the slightly terrified look of a 22-year-old about to ask for something important. Mr. Hayes, he said. Jerome, I've been thinking. He stopped, started again. I've been thinking about getting my A&P certification, airframe and power plant. I've been talking to the community college about the program. He paused. If I did that, if I got certified, would there be a place for me here long term, I mean? Not just as an apprentice. Malcolm looked at him. He thought about a 22-year-old who had worked 2 overnight shifts without complaint, who asked the right questions, who had installed a fuel bracket correctly on the first try, because he understood that there were no second tries. He thought about himself at 22, the shop where he'd started. The older mechanic who had looked at him and said, "You can do this work if you're willing to do it right." "Get the certification," Malcolm said. "When you have it, come talk to me." Jerome nodded, turned to go. "Jerome," Malcolm said. He stopped. "Don't rush it," Malcolm said. "The certification is not the point. Understanding what you're certifying is the point. Take your time with the material." "Yes, sir," Jerome said, and left. Rachel appeared in the doorway where Jerome had just been. "You realize he's going to get that certification in 18 months, she said. "Probably," Malcolm said. "And then he's going to want a raise." "He'll have earned one," Malcolm said. She shook her head in the way she always shook her head, not in disagreement, in something that looked a lot like affection for a man who was incapable of doing things the easy way. The charter company meeting happened on a Thursday as scheduled. 6 Aircraft Love Field, a family-owned operation that had been in business for 30 years and had never had a safety incident and wanted to keep it that way. The owner was a man named Roy Castillo, 63 years old, who shook Malcolm's hand with the firmness of someone who had built something real and knew what real looked like in other people. "I heard what you did for Sterling Crown," Roy said. "I did what the job required," Malcolm said. "That's what I heard," Roy said. "That's why you're here." They talked for 90 minutes. Malcolm walked Roy through the inspection methodology, not the Sterling Crown story, not the fraud, not the federal investigation. The methodology. The documentation discipline. The way every component got cross-referenced, every serial number chased every system accessed in the sequence it needed to be accessed. The way the logbook was the product, not the aircraft. Roy listened, the way Daniel listened, the way Delgado had listened, with real attention. At the end he said, "What's your rate?" Malcolm quoted it. Roy didn't flinch. "When can you start?" 3 weeks, Malcolm said. "We have existing commitments." 3 weeks works, Roy said. They shook hands again. On the drive back to the shop, Malcolm thought about what his operation looked like now versus what it had looked like 8 weeks ago. The lease that had 18 days left on its grace period. The equipment he'd sold. Maya asking in that steady, careful voice whether they were going to lose the hangar. The invoice that a woman had laughed at in a conference room full of attorneys. He thought about how close the margin had been, and then he thought about the margin. About how it had never actually been financial. The financial margin was terrifying. Yes, but the real margin, the one that had mattered when everything was in the balance, had been much simpler. It was the distance between signing something and not signing something. Between the key on the table and the key in his pocket. Between what a man would accept and what a man would refuse. That margin had never been close. Not for 1 second. His phone rang. He answered on speaker. "Mr. Hayes." A voice he didn't recognize. Male professional careful. "My name is Robert Liang. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Western Pacific Charter Group. We operate 14 aircraft across 6 western states. I was given your name by Frank Delgado at the FAA Dallas field office." Malcolm glanced at his phone and back at the road. "He gave you my number," he said. "He gave it to our legal department," Robert Liang said. Along with what he described as the most thorough voluntary safety documentation submission his office had received in over a decade. A pause. He said, and I'm quoting, that if we ever wanted someone to actually find problems in our fleet before the problems found us, we should call Malcolm Hayes. Malcolm drove in silence for a moment. 14 aircraft, 6 western states. Mr. Liang, he said, I'm going to need to call you back. I want to have my operations manager on the call. Of course, Liang said. Whenever you're ready. He hung up. He called Rachel. She answered. If you're about to tell me we have another inquiry. 14 aircraft, he said. Western Pacific Charter Group. Delgado gave them our name. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. I'll hire a second coordinator, she said. Today, he said. Yesterday, she said. Malcolm, I posted that listing yesterday. He almost laughed. He didn't. But it was close. He pulled into the Hayes Aero Works lot and sat in the truck for a moment before going inside. He looked at the name above the door. Hayes Aero Works. Same name as 6 weeks ago. Same building, same hangar. Different everything else. He went inside. Maya was there. That was unexpected. It was 3:40 in the afternoon on a school day, and his daughter was sitting in the client chair across from his desk, her backpack on the floor, her homework glasses on a book open on her lap. School let out early, she said before he could ask. Teacher planning day. I took the bus. You didn't call, he said. I texted, she said. You were driving. He looked at his phone. She had texted. He'd missed it. He sat down at his desk. She looked at him over her book. You look different again, she said. Different how? Like you did that first day when she paid you, she said. But more. He thought about that. About how a child's observation is often more precise than an adult's self-analysis. It was a good day, he said. Did something happen? The FAA referred us to a new client, he said. 14 aircraft. She did the arithmetic immediately the way she always did. That's more than sterling crown. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Is this because you didn't sign the certificate? She said. When she wouldn't pay you. He thought about how to answer that honestly. That's part of it, he said. But it started before that. It started because I spent 19 years building a reputation for not signing things I wasn't certain about. The certificate was just the moment when that reputation became visible to people who hadn't seen it before. She considered that. She turned a page in her book. Then she said without looking up, Mom would have said the same thing. He looked at her. She used to say that integrity is just discipline over time, Maya said. She said most people have integrity for a day, some for a week, but the ones who actually build something have it every day for years until it's not even a choice anymore. It's just who they are. Malcolm sat with that. His wife had said that. He remembered when she'd said it. He hadn't known then that she was also describing the man she'd married. He knew it now. Go do your homework, he said. I'm already doing it, she said, holding up the book. That's not homework, that's a novel. It's an assigned novel, she said. Homework. He went back to work. The deposition happened on a Friday morning 3 weeks after the warrant. Malcolm sat across from a federal prosecutor for 4 hours and answered every question with the same quality of attention. He gave a maintenance log completely accurately, without embellishment or omission. Patricia Osei sat beside him and intervened twice both times to clarify a question rather than block an answer, because the answers were solid and she knew it. The prosecutor, a young woman with the efficient energy of someone who had already read everything and was confirming what she knew, asked him at one point, Mr. Hayes, when you first identified the anomalous component in the flight control assembly, what was your primary concern? Malcolm thought about it. The aircraft, he said. Someone was going to fly it. Not the invoice dispute. The invoice dispute was a business problem, he said. The component was an aircraft problem. Those are different categories. How do you separate them in the moment under that kind of financial pressure? He looked at her. The same way I separate everything, he said. I ask one question. Would I put my daughter on it? She wrote something down. When he walked out of the federal building at 2 in the afternoon, Patricia was beside him. "That went well?" she said. "I know," he said. "You're not a natural witness," she said. "You're too specific. But in this case, specific is exactly right because every single specific thing you said is documented." She paused. "Malcolm, I've been practicing law for 22 years. I have represented contractors in safety disputes more times than I can count. I have never had a client whose documentation was so thoroughly its own defense." She looked at him. "You know that most people would have signed the certificate. Under that financial pressure with that deadline with Sterling Crown's legal team threatening litigation, most people would have signed and walked away." "I know," he said. "Why didn't you?" He thought about the answer he'd given a federal prosecutor an hour ago. About his daughter. About the aircraft. About different categories. But the real answer was simpler. "Because I'm paid to make sure it comes back," he said. "Not just that it takes off." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once with the expression of someone who has just heard a thing they are going to remember for a long time. She went to her car. He went to his truck. He drove back to the shop. 3 months after the morning Victoria Sterling laughed at his invoice. Malcolm Hayes stood in Hangar 7 of the Sterling Crown Executive Airfield and watched the first flight of the restored Bombardier Global 7500. He'd spent 9 days in that aircraft with his team. After the fleet audit concluded 9 days of replacement and inspection. Every questionable component removed and replaced, every system verified against its original specification. Every wire run traced and confirmed. No shortcuts, no executive deadlines, no pressure. When he was done, the aircraft was cleaner than it had been when it rolled off the manufacturer's line. He opened the maintenance logbook one last time. He looked at the page. He picked up his pen. He signed his name. Daniel Mercer was waiting at the bottom of the air stairs. He looked at Malcolm as he came out of the aircraft. Malcolm gave him a single nod. Daniel picked up his flight bag. He walked up the stairs. He sat in the left seat and started running the pre-flight checklist with the calm, methodical attention of a man who had been doing this for 31 years and intended to keep doing it right. Victoria Sterling was standing on the tarmac at a distance. Not crowding. Not managing. Just watching. Rachel was beside Malcolm. Jerome was there too because he'd worked 8 of the 9 days on the restoration, and he'd earned the right to see it fly. The aircraft taxied to the runway. It held position for a moment, the brief poised stillness of a machine gathering itself before it commits to the sky. Then it moved. It accelerated down the runway with the contained authority of something built correctly and maintained correctly and certified by someone whose name meant what it said. It lifted. Clean. Smooth. Without hesitation. Malcolm watched it climb. He watched until it was small against the Texas sky. He watched until it was gone. Jerome said quietly, "That's something." "Yeah," Malcolm said. Rachel said nothing. She just stood there watching the empty sky where the aircraft had been with the expression of someone who understood exactly what that departure had cost and what it had taken to earn it. Victoria walked over. She stood beside Malcolm and looked at the sky. "Thank you," she said. "It's what you paid for," he said. "I paid for the restoration," she said. "The rest?" She stopped. "The rest you did because it was the right thing to do." I thought about that. About whether it was that simple. "I did my job," he said. "Every part of it." She was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say that the most dangerous people in aviation aren't the reckless ones," she said. "He said the reckless ones are visible. The most dangerous ones are the ones who are almost careful. The ones who do 95% of the job correctly and convince themselves the last 5% doesn't matter." She paused. He was talking about himself, a warning to himself. She looked at Malcolm. He was also talking about me. "He wrote your name on a list," Malcolm said. "A list of people he was worried about. That's not someone who had given up on you." She looked at the sky for a long moment. "I know," she said quietly. "I know that now." They stood in silence for a while. Then a town car pulled up at the edge of the tarmac, and Victoria's assistant got out with a phone and a schedule, and the look of a world that kept moving regardless of what had just climbed into the Texas sky. Victoria straightened up. She was a CEO again. She was always a CEO. But she was a different one than the woman who had laughed at an invoice. She turned to go. Stopped. The board wants to know, she said, whether Hayes Aero Works is interested in serving as independent safety inspector for 2 additional aircraft we're adding to the fleet next quarter. Malcolm looked at Rachel. Rachel pulled up her scheduling tablet without being asked. We have capacity in Q2, she said. March would work. Victoria nodded once. March it is. She looked at Malcolm one more time. Give my regards to Maya. She walked to the town car and was gone. Jerome turned to Malcolm. She knows Maya's name. Long story, Malcolm said. Is it a good one? Malcolm looked at the empty sky. At the place where the aircraft had been. At the tarmac, where 7 pilots had once refused to move, and a woman had offered bonuses to men who understood that money wasn't the currency that mattered. Yeah, he said. It's a good one. He picked up his tools. He walked back toward the shop. Because the work was always the work. The aircraft on the ground right now. The logbook open on the workbench. The serial number that needed to be chased, and the wire run that needed to be traced, and the signature that meant something because of every other time it had been withheld. Hayes Aero Works had started with a man. A small shop and a discipline that most people found inconvenient. It had survived a woman's contempt, a financial cliff edge, a federal investigation, and the discovery of a fraud that ran deeper than anyone had known on the morning the pilots refused. It had survived because Malcolm Hayes had spent 19 years building a reputation for one thing and one thing only. Not speed, not price, not the ability to work within someone's deadline, or accommodate someone's pressure, or find a creative interpretation of airworthiness that let a powerful person get what they wanted. One thing. He wouldn't sign something he wasn't certain about. That was it. That was the whole of it. And in the end, that single repeated unglamorous, financially costly, professionally isolating commitment made not once under dramatic circumstances, but 10,000 times in empty hangars with no one watching had become the most valuable thing in private aviation that money could not manufacture and power could not compel. His name. What it meant when it appeared in a logbook. What it meant when it didn't. Malcolm Hayes drove back to his shop, parked his truck, walked through the door with his name above it, and got back to work. Because somewhere in this country right now, an aircraft was about to carry someone's husband, someone's mother, someone's child across the sky at 40,000 feet. And they deserved to come back. That was the job. It was always the job. And Malcolm Hayes had never once not for $45,000, not for $286,000. Not for the threat of a litigation team or the contempt of a conference room, stopped doing it.